I became a foster dad to a quiet, broken kid. All she brought to my house was a creased photograph of her mother. When I showed that picture to my brother, he went completely pale. He whispered that he knew exactly who she was and told me we had to run immediately. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Hollis, and I am 69 years old. I spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer building foundations meant to last centuries. I never expected the foundation of my own family to crumble so completely. That Tuesday afternoon, I brought 15-year-old Ebony into my home. She carried a small garbage bag of clothes and a silence so heavy it seemed to consume the oxygen in the room. I led her to the guest bedroom I had prepared. I approached life the same way I approached my career in engineering. Everything must be methodical, measured, and secure. I had reinforced the window latches, sanded down the floorboards until they were perfectly smooth, and aligned her modest bed specifically to catch the morning sun. I wanted her to feel an absolute sense of safety in a world that had clearly failed her. Ebony sat on the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at the wall. She possessed the weary posture of someone who had spent her entire short life waiting for the next disaster to strike. I placed a fresh folded towel on her wooden desk and told her quietly she could stay here forever. I walked away to brew a fresh pot of hot black coffee. I was pouring water into the coffee maker when the front door swung open. My biological daughter Monica walked in, followed closely by her husband Bradley. They had used their spare key without knocking. Bradley stepped into my living room wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than my first car. He immediately wrinkled his nose at the smell of old wood and the sight of my worn corduroy armchair. He possessed a terrifyingly arrogant demeanor that Monica mistook for ambition. Bradley loudly announced that the house smelled like a museum of failures. Monica did not correct him. She simply crossed her arms and refused to look me in the eye. Bradley paced across the faded rug and laughed bitterly. He asked why a man of my advanced age was suddenly taking in stray charity cases from the neighborhood. He declared that I was barely capable of taking care of myself, let alone a troubled teenager. The financial tension he brought into the room was a physical weight. I knew Bradley ran a commercial real estate development firm that always seemed to be chasing the next massive payout. He viewed every person and every piece of property strictly as a stepping stone for his own financial elevation. I stood silently by the kitchen counter holding my ceramic mug. I did not offer them a seat. I simply watched my daughter stand by a man who treated her father with absolute disdain. Bradley walked over to the kitchen table with a deeply calculated smirk on his face. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick document. He slapped the heavy folder down onto the wooden surface. I knew immediately that this visit was a hostile negotiation. He wanted something from me right now. I waited in silence. Bradley slid a glossy promotional brochure across the kitchen table alongside the legal documents. The bright letters on the cover advertised a low-income assisted living facility located on the absolute outskirts of the city. He tapped his manicured finger against the paperwork. He stated in a cold, commanding voice that it was time for me to face reality. Bradley demanded that I sign over the deed to my property immediately. He claimed he desperately needed the equity of my land to secure the funding for his new commercial real estate venture. He insisted that the facility in the brochure was perfectly adequate for a man in my declining condition. Monica finally spoke up softly, telling me that Bradley was right and that I was becoming a severe burden to their future plans. I looked down at the table I had eaten breakfast at for over 30 years. I thought about the sweat and labor it took to pay off this mortgage entirely. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not shed a single tear of disappointment. I simply placed my coffee mug down on the counter with a quiet thud. I completely ignored the glossy brochure and the aggressive legal documents. I looked directly into Bradley's eyes with the cold clarity of a man who refuses to be intimidated. I calmly instructed them to turn around and leave my house immediately. I told them the conversation was permanently over and that my property would never belong to them. Bradley's face flushed red with sudden anger. He leaned over the table aggressively, attempting to physically intimidate me into compliance. I did not flinch or take a single step backward toward the wall. I simply stared at him in absolute unbroken silence, waiting for his exit. Bradley scoffed loudly, throwing his hands up in the air in an exaggerated display of frustration. He turned to Monica and stated viciously that her father's mind was clearly rotting away. He declared that my refusal to hand over the estate was proof of my severe cognitive decline and that he would easily have me declared legally incompetent by a judge. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the front entryway. As they turned to leave, Bradley glanced toward the dark hallway leading to the guest rooms. Ebony had silently stepped out of her room and was standing in the shadows watching the commotion. Bradley stopped dead in his tracks. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a stark, sudden edge of pure panic. He dropped his briefcase onto the floorboards. His eyes widened as he stared intently at the 15-year-old girl. He took a hesitant step forward and asked her name with a trembling voice that betrayed a deep, hidden terror. Ebony did not answer him. She simply took a step backward, pulling her worn sweater tightly around her shoulders. I immediately stepped between them, physically blocking Bradley's line of sight. I used my broad shoulders to completely shield the frightened teenager from his predatory gaze. I grabbed Bradley firmly by the collar of his expensive suit jacket and physically forced him out the front door. I slammed the heavy oak door shut and locked the deadbolt. The silence returned to the house, but the atmosphere was permanently altered. I realized in that exact moment Bradley did not just want my house for financial gain. He recognized the orphaned girl standing in my hallway. I knew he was absolutely terrified of her presence here. The quiet adjustment of my life had officially begun. The heavy oak door clicked shut, sealing the house in a thick, vibrating silence. I turned away from the entryway and found Ebony sitting perfectly still on the hallway runner. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest and her breathing was shallow, rapid, and uneven. She looked like a fragile structure on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. The brief encounter with the husband of my daughter had completely shattered the quiet safety I had painstakingly built for her over the past 2 days. I knelt down slowly, making sure my movements were highly visible and deliberate. As a structural engineer, I learned early on that you never apply sudden pressure to a compromised foundation. You must assess the overall damage first. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched a small rectangular object against her faded denim jacket. It was a photograph. The edges were severely blackened, warped by extreme heat, and a deep crease ran directly down the center of the glossy paper. I did not ask her to hand it over. I did not bombard her with questions about why his sudden appearance had caused her to retreat into a state of absolute terror. Instead, I simply sat on the floor beside her, leaving exactly 2 feet of open space between us. I told her that the man who just left would never step foot inside this house again. I spoke with the calm, unwavering certainty of a man who builds things designed to withstand violent hurricanes. Ebony did not reply, but her grip on the burned photograph loosened just a fraction. She uncurled her fingers, revealing the clear image of a smiling woman holding a much younger Ebony. The woman in the picture wore a bright yellow safety vest over her clean professional work blouse. I recognized the local city uniform immediately. I was about to ask Ebony where she had found the picture when 3 sharp knocks echoed from the front entryway. It was my younger brother Willis, arriving precisely on time for our regular Wednesday afternoon visit. Willis spent 35 years working as a senior auditor for the municipal government before retiring last spring. He possessed an incredibly sharp analytical mind, perfectly trained to detect financial anomalies and hidden irregularities across massive corporate tax filings. I stood up and walked down the short corridor to unlatch the heavy deadbolt. Willis stepped inside carrying 2 large cups of black coffee from the corner bakery. He started talking immediately about the brutal traffic on the interstate, completely unaware of the intense psychological warfare that had just occurred inside my living room. I quietly gestured toward the hallway runner where Ebony remained seated. Willis stopped talking mid-sentence. He placed the cardboard coffee carrier carefully onto the small wooden console table near the doorway. He offered Ebony a warm, reassuring smile, attempting to ease the obvious tension radiating from her fragile posture. He took a slow, cautious step forward and gently introduced himself. Ebony did not look up at his face. She kept her eyes locked securely onto the burned photograph resting in her lap. Willis leaned forward slightly to get a better look at the image she was guarding with such desperate intensity. I watched his reaction closely. The moment his eyes registered the face of the smiling woman wearing the bright yellow safety vest, the friendly warmth completely vanished from his expression. The rich, dark brown complexion of his face turned an alarming shade of pale gray. He stopped breathing. He stared at the glossy paper with absolute naked terror in his wide-open eyes at that very specific moment. Willis did not say a single word to the frightened girl sitting on the hallway runner. He suddenly grabbed me by the forearm with tremendous force and physically pulled me backward into the adjacent kitchen. He shut the door behind us, ensuring Ebony could not hear our urgent conversation. His hands were shaking just as violently as hers had been moments earlier. He leaned in close and whispered that the woman in the creased photograph was Valerie Thorne. The name immediately triggered a deep, unsettling memory within my own professional archives. Valerie Thorne had been the lead municipal structural inspector working for the city planning department exactly 10 years ago. Willis explained rapidly that Valerie was the only official who possessed the moral integrity to refuse to sign off on the massive commercial waterfront development project that launched Bradley into extreme wealth. She had discovered massive critical flaws in the foundational engineering plans and possessed the concrete documentation to prove Bradley was using lethal, substandard steel materials to cut his operational costs. Willis looked at me with eyes wide with absolute horror. He reminded me that Valerie Thorne never got the chance to submit her final structural safety report to the grand jury. Exactly 1 week after she officially denied the final waterfront building permits, her residential house burned completely to the ground in the middle of the night. The corrupt local police precinct ruled the catastrophic blaze a tragic electrical accident and permanently closed the official investigation within 48 hours. Bradley secured his final building permits the very next morning. Willis stated clearly that the girl sitting in my hallway was the only surviving witness to a heavily orchestrated corporate assassination. The husband of my only daughter was undoubtedly a ruthless criminal mastermind who killed without any hesitation. I absorbed the devastating information with the stoic discipline I had perfected over my long career constructing load-bearing walls. I did not allow panic to cloud my judgment. I turned my head slowly toward the kitchen window to process the sudden revelation of Bradley's murderous past. Willis followed my gaze out the glass panes. He stepped closer to the window and carefully pulled the sheer fabric curtain back just an inch. The bright afternoon sunlight illuminated the quiet suburban street outside my home. A massive black sports utility vehicle with heavily tinted windows was now idling silently directly across from my driveway. It had no license plates. It was parked at an aggressive angle, perfectly positioned to block any vehicle attempting to exit my small property. Willis dropped the thin curtain back into place, as if the fabric itself had suddenly caught fire. He turned to face me, and the lingering dread in his expression escalated into sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly what that vehicle represented. Bradley had realized the fatal error of leaving a living witness behind and had immediately dispatched his private security contractors to rectify his decade-old mistake. The men inside that dark vehicle were not there to negotiate or deliver legal documents. They were violent cleaners hired to erase Ebony permanently. Willis grabbed my shoulder with a vice-like grip. He leaned forward and whispered in a raw, urgent voice that we needed to leave this house immediately. He stated that we did not have time to pack bags or call the authorities. I looked toward the hallway where the young girl was still sitting. I nodded once, confirming that the silent adjustment of my life had now escalated into absolute and total war against my own corrupted and murderous family members today. I watched through this narrow gap in the living room curtains as the heavy doors of the black utility vehicle swung open. 2 men wearing unremarkable gray suits stepped out onto the cracked pavement. They did not walk with the hesitant gait of salesmen or lost drivers. They moved with a synchronized, rigid efficiency that immediately broadcast their violent intentions. They approached my front porch with absolute purpose. I let the curtain fall back into place. Panic is a structural flaw in the human mind, and I had trained myself to eliminate it decades ago. I turned to my brother Willis and nodded silently. I moved swiftly down the hall and retrieved a heavy canvas duffel bag from the hall closet. I had packed this bag 5 years ago after noticing the first unsettling discrepancies in Bradley's initial property acquisitions. I slung the thick strap over my shoulder and reached out my calloused hand toward Ebony. The teenager was trembling violently against the wall. I did not offer false assurances or waste time explaining the immediate danger. I simply told her that we were leaving right now and that she needed to stay completely quiet. She looked at my outstretched hand for a fraction of a second before placing her small fingers inside my palm. Her grip was desperately tight. I led her away from the front of the house and guided her toward the heavy wooden door of the cellar. Willis followed closely behind us, his breathing heavy but controlled. We descended the steep wooden staircase into the cool, damp darkness of the basement. Above us, I could clearly hear the sudden thud of heavy boots stepping aggressively onto the wooden planks of my front porch. The violent intrusion into my property had officially begun right above our heads. I moved directly toward the heavy rusted iron latch securing the slanted storm doors at the rear of the cellar. The metal was old and stubborn, but I knew exactly where to apply precise structural pressure to avoid making any scraping sounds. The heavy doors yielded silently under my firm upward push. I climbed the short concrete incline and stepped out into the overgrown weeds of the back alleyway. I pulled Ebony up beside me while Willis quickly followed. I lowered the iron doors back into place, ensuring they rested flush against the foundation. We stood in the narrow corridor separating my property from the neighboring backyards. The high wooden fences provided immediate visual cover from the main street. I took the lead, guiding them down the hidden residential pathways I had mapped out meticulously over the past 20 years. I knew every blind spot, every broken fence slat, and every unlit corridor in this specific neighborhood. We moved rapidly but quietly, avoiding the loose gravel and dried leaves that would betray our position. Ebony matched my pace perfectly, her fear translating into absolute compliance. We crossed 2 adjacent property lines and slipped through a narrow maintenance easement located behind the community center. We emerged onto a quiet parallel street exactly 1 block away from the active threat. Willis's dark blue sedan was parked under the heavy canopy of an old oak tree, perfectly concealed from the main intersection. I instructed Willis to unlock the vehicle remotely. We approached the car from the passenger side, keeping our profiles low against the parked vehicles lining the curb. We had successfully executed the physical extraction without raising a single alarm. The men tearing apart my living room remained completely unaware that their primary target had already vanished into the surrounding suburban landscape. Before getting inside the vehicle, I paused and looked back through the narrow gap between 2 brick houses. My vantage point offered a clear, unobstructed line of sight directly to my front porch. I watched intently as the 2 suited men approached my heavy front door. I expected them to deploy a battering ram or utilize specialized lock-picking tools to force their entry. Instead, one of the men casually reached out and flipped open the protective cover of my digital security keypad. He punched in a specific 6-digit numerical sequence with absolute confidence. A small green light flashed brightly, indicating the deadbolt had automatically disengaged. He turned the brass handle and stepped inside my private sanctuary without encountering a single physical obstacle. A cold, calculated realization settled deep inside my chest, replacing any lingering trace of paternal sentiment. That specific digital access code was highly restricted. I had never shared those numbers with anyone outside of my immediate biological family. I gave that code to my daughter Monica 5 years ago strictly for emergency medical access. The men invading my home did not guess the sequence. Monica had deliberately handed over my private security credentials to her husband. She had knowingly provided Bradley with the exact keys required to execute his violent ambitions against my household. My own flesh and blood had actively facilitated an organized intrusion intended to end my life and silence a vulnerable child. The depth of her betrayal was absolute and unforgivable. I turned my back on the compromised house and climbed into the passenger seat of the dark blue sedan. I securely locked the car door and instructed my younger brother to start the engine immediately. The familial bond between my daughter Monica and me was officially and permanently severed forever starting today. Willis shifted the vehicle into gear and merged seamlessly into the steady flow of afternoon traffic. We navigated away from the residential district, keeping a careful watch for any secondary pursuit vehicles. The interior of the sedan was thick with heavy, unspoken tension. I sat in the front passenger seat, mentally reviewing the structural layout of my compromised home, assessing exactly what Bradley's men would find. Ebony was seated directly behind me, clutching the burned photograph against her chest with white-knuckled intensity. For 2 entire days, she had existed in a state of absolute, profound silence. She had not uttered a single word since stepping foot onto my property. Suddenly, her small, quiet voice broke through the rhythmic humming of the car engine. The sound was incredibly fragile, but lined with an undeniable core of absolute certainty. She stated clearly that the men invading my house were completely wasting their time. Willis glanced at her through the rearview mirror while maintaining his strict focus on the roadway ahead. I turned in my seat to look at the young girl directly. She met my intense gaze without ever flinching. She explained that her mother knew Bradley was planning to silence her 10 years ago. Valerie Thorne was a brilliant inspector who understood the fatal consequences of uncovering massive corporate fraud. Ebony revealed that her mother had meticulously compiled every piece of damning evidence into a heavy physical ledger. She stated that her mother hid that exact ledger inside a highly secure downtown bank vault just hours before our family home was deliberately burned to the ground. The men in the suits were hunting for a ghost document that did not reside in my house. The true foundation of Bradley's criminal empire was locked securely away downtown, patiently waiting for us. Willis drove us through the labyrinth of industrial backroads until the towering glass structures of the financial district faded into the rearview mirror. He navigated the sedan toward a heavily wooded acreage on the northern perimeter of the county. We turned down an unpaved gravel driveway completely obscured by dense weeping willows and overgrown blackberry bushes. The vehicle came to a slow halt in front of a modest mid-century farmhouse. My late wife purchased this secluded property entirely in cash 20 years ago. She was a brilliant woman who deeply understood the fundamental necessity of possessing a quiet sanctuary disconnected from public records and municipal tax grids. Monica never knew this house existed. It was our absolute secret. We stepped out of the vehicle, and the biting chill of the evening wind hit my face. I unlocked the heavy reinforced iron door and ushered Ebony inside. The interior smelled faintly of cedar wood and old canvas drop cloths. I directed my brother to lock the deadbolts and shut the heavy wooden blinds while I set up our temporary operational base at the solid oak dining table. I needed immediate liquid capital to sustain our sudden isolation and fund our next tactical maneuvers. I pulled my secure laptop from my canvas duffel bag and booted up the operating system. I navigated directly to the online portal for my primary banking institution. I intended to transfer $50,000 from my standard retirement savings into an untraceable offshore account I had established decades ago. I typed in my secure credentials with absolute precision, expecting to see the familiar financial cushion I had carefully amassed through 40 years of grueling structural engineering work. I pressed the enter key and waited in complete silence for the server to fully load my personal financial dashboard. The digital screen refreshed, illuminating the dark room with a harsh, glaring light. I stared at the bold numbers displayed across my checking and savings accounts. The screen revealed absolute zero balances across every single primary tier. My monthly municipal pension deposit was completely intercepted. The extensive savings account I utilized for my daily living expenses had been ruthlessly drained down to the absolute final cent. A bright red notification banner materialized across the top of the monitor, indicating a severe external override. I clicked the blinking icon and brought up the corresponding legal authorization form submitted to the bank earlier this afternoon. Monica had successfully executed a heavily forged medical proxy, legally declaring me mentally incapacitated and assuming total unilateral control over my personal finances. She had weaponized the fraudulent document Bradley waved in my face to systematically eradicate my entire financial existence within a matter of mere hours. The betrayal was meticulously calculated to ensure I could not fight back or hire external legal counsel. Monica fully intended to leave her own father entirely destitute out on the street, unable to even purchase a tank of gasoline to escape her husband's violent enforcers. She was starving me out to guarantee my forced submission into that horrific assisted living facility. I sat back in the solid oak chair, feeling the chilled air of the secluded farmhouse settle heavily over my broad shoulders. Willis leaned over my shoulder, reading the catastrophic financial numbers displayed on the glowing screen. He asked me in a broken whisper what we were going to do now that my daughter had completely destroyed my primary funding. I calmly reached out and closed the main browser window, completely unfazed by her desperate, pathetic attempt at gaining total leverage over me right here, right now, this evening. The final invisible thread of parental leniency I had carefully maintained for Monica instantly snapped inside my chest. She had deliberately chosen greed and malice over her own flesh and blood. I reached into the hidden side pocket of my leather briefcase and retrieved a small encrypted physical drive. I inserted the metallic device directly into the side port of my laptop, bypassing the standard commercial internet network. Monica and Bradley truly believed I was merely a poor retired laborer clinging to a dilapidated suburban house. They possessed no comprehension of the massive hidden wealth I had meticulously accumulated during my highly lucrative decades in structural engineering. I launched a secondary, heavily encrypted terminal utilizing a complex biometric verification protocol. The dark interface flickered open, displaying the true magnitude of my vast, untouchable financial empire. I had purposefully structured my assets into a heavily shielded anonymous blind trust over 15 years ago specifically to protect my investments from greedy, predatory developers. Bradley was entirely oblivious to the monumental fact that my blind trust completely owned the massive commercial land directly beneath his shiny new corporate headquarters building downtown. He had built his entire fragile empire upon a patch of soil I fully controlled. Every time he parked his expensive sports car in his executive parking garage, he was technically resting upon my concrete property. I scrolled through the massive available cash reserves held firmly within the secure offshore trust accounts. The numbers reflected an unassailable financial fortress capable of destroying his entire development company within minutes. My daughter had attempted to completely crush a retired old man without ever realizing she had willingly declared a ruthless corporate war against a highly motivated financial ghost. I was holding the ultimate master key to her completely fake, luxurious lifestyle right now, today. I pulled a highly encrypted prepaid cellular device from my duffel bag and quickly entered a private contact number. I waited exactly 2 rings before my most trusted confidant and corporate attorney answered the secure line. Garfield possessed a famously cold and remarkably brilliant legal mind perfectly suited for dismantling corrupt commercial empires piece by piece. He had spent decades legally protecting my hidden structural investments from ambitious corporate predators attempting to steal my intellectual property. I did not exchange any polite pleasantries regarding the unusually late hour of my unexpected call. I informed Garfield that Bradley and Monica had officially crossed the absolute point of no return by attempting to seize my personal residential property using a completely fraudulent medical proxy document. I told him they had also violently breached my home using aggressive private contractors attempting to silence a highly vulnerable orphaned teenager who held devastating evidence against them. Garfield exhaled sharply, acknowledging the sudden dramatic escalation of the crisis. He calmly asked me what specific legal countermeasure I wanted his high-powered firm to execute against my daughter and her deeply arrogant husband. I looked across the dimly lit room at the traumatized young girl sitting silently on the worn farmhouse sofa. I felt the immense quiet power of my anonymous financial leverage pulsing through my veins. I instructed Garfield to immediately initiate a completely hostile financial freeze on every single commercial asset connected to Bradley's rapidly expanding development company. I ordered him to legally paralyze their corporate banking lines, block their ongoing construction permits, and effectively choke off their primary oxygen supply without offering any warning whatsoever. I disconnected the secure phone call, knowing the silent adjustment had finally shifted from basic evasion into an absolute total offensive strike against my own treacherous family starting tonight. The morning sunlight barely crested the horizon when my encrypted communications terminal flagged a highly urgent municipal legal filing. Bradley had not simply absorbed the devastating shock of my initial financial freeze. He retaliated with the vicious speed of a cornered predator utilizing the absolute worst elements of his corrupted local influence. He submitted a heavily expedited fraudulent emergency court order directly to a sympathetic judge currently residing on his corporate payroll. The fabricated legal documents claimed that my cognitive decline had rapidly devolved into a severe paranoid delusion. Furthermore, the filing explicitly stated that I had been violently kidnapped from my own residence by a highly dangerous and unstable runaway foster child. Bradley intentionally weaponized Ebony's vulnerable status within the state system to paint her as a violent threat to my physical safety. He formally activated the heavily forged medical proxy Monica had provided him, establishing a legally binding narrative that I was entirely incapable of managing my own daily survival. The corrupted magistrate signed the emergency injunction without requesting a single medical evaluation or scheduling a mandatory preliminary hearing. The ink on the judicial signature granted Bradley immediate temporary legal guardianship over my entire visible estate. He effectively possessed the absolute legal authority to liquidate my residential property, lock down my physical movements, and demand immediate police intervention to extract the teenager he desperately needed to silence. My own biological daughter had proudly stood before a judge and sworn under penalty of perjury that her father was a broken captive in need of forceful rescue. She cemented her total complicity in a carefully engineered plot to erase a helpless child and strip me of my basic human autonomy. The false guardianship now transformed a quiet private family dispute into a highly visible legal manhunt across the entire state. Willis paced the heavy hardwood floor of the secluded farmhouse, reading the digitized court documents over my shoulder with mounting righteous outrage. His entire career as a strict municipal auditor was built upon an unwavering belief in proper civic procedures and the fundamental protection of the law. He immediately reached into his dark coat pocket and pulled out his cellular phone, demanding we call the state police to report the fraudulent judicial filing. I stood up from the oak dining table and swiftly clamped my hand over his wrist, forcing him to lower the device. I stared intensely into my younger brother's eyes and ordered him to maintain his absolute composure. I explained with grim clarity that standard law enforcement protocols no longer applied to our current survival. Bradley did not just purchase favors from isolated judges to construct his commercial empire. He heavily financed the local police precinct captain through a continuous series of anonymous corporate donations funneled through legitimate-looking charity galas. The officers patrolling our previous neighborhood were effectively acting as a publicly funded private security force for Bradley's vast real estate operations. If Willis dialed the emergency dispatch number, the operators would simply route our exact location directly to the corrupted precinct captain. A heavily armed tactical unit would immediately swarm the farmhouse under the absolute false pretense of rescuing a mentally compromised senior citizen from a dangerous kidnapper. I reminded Willis that Ebony was the primary target of this aggressive legal manipulation. Going to the local police would completely bypass Bradley's need for anonymous mercenaries and allow him to utilize the state to capture her. Surrendering to the local authorities would literally mean handing the traumatized teenager directly over to the exact same powerful man who ruthlessly ordered the fiery assassination of her courageous mother. I stepped away from the heavy oak table and reestablished the secure connection with Garfield. My trusted attorney possessed a remarkably clinical approach to destructive corporate litigation. I briefed him entirely on the fraudulent guardianship filing and Bradley's aggressive move to legally seize my physical assets through the corrupted municipal courts. Garfield initially suggested filing an immediate emergency counter-injunction to completely halt the asset transfer and publicly expose the heavily forged medical proxy. I stopped him immediately. I explained that fighting the guardianship order in a compromised local court would drain valuable time and potentially reveal my hidden financial capabilities too early in the escalating conflict. I wanted to utilize Bradley's boundless arrogance directly against him. I instructed Garfield to stand down and deliberately allow the fraudulent guardianship order to proceed entirely uncontested through the standard municipal channels. Willis stared at me in absolute shock as I calmly outlined the counterintuitive strategy over the secure connection. I told Garfield we needed to provide Bradley with the exact illusion of a flawless, uncontested victory. We would allow him to legally process the paperwork required to forcefully acquire my original residential property. I knew Bradley's ultimate goal was not simply to own my modest house, but to leverage its underlying land equity to fund his latest corporate expansion. Therefore, he would invariably attempt to transfer the property deed directly from my stolen personal estate into his primary commercial development portfolio. Garfield fell completely silent on the other end of the secure line, instantly grasping the sheer brilliance of the devastating legal trap I was setting. He confirmed that allowing the seamless transfer would perfectly execute the strategy without drawing any suspicion. We were going to hand Bradley the exact rope he so desperately needed to effectively hang his entire corporate empire. I terminated the encrypted connection with Garfield and closed the laptop screen. I turned to explain the precise mechanics of the impending corporate execution to Willis. 20 years ago, I legally purchased the land where my house currently sits. During the initial municipal land survey, I discovered a buried stream heavily contaminated by an old, forgotten industrial factory. As a licensed senior structural engineer, I understood the catastrophic legal implications of environmental hazards regarding real estate zoning laws. I deliberately registered the residential property under a highly specialized corporate designation, perfectly masking a dormant but astronomically expensive environmental remediation tax lien. As long as the house remained classified as an independent primary residence, the tax liability remained entirely dormant and uncollectible by the federal government. However, the absolute second that Bradley legally attached the residential deed to his massive commercial development portfolio, he would instantly violate the dormant isolation clause. By attempting to greedily absorb my modest property into his primary corporate holdings, he would unknowingly awaken the dormant tax beast. The federal environmental lien would instantly activate and legally bond itself directly to the core financial arteries of his entire commercial enterprise. The resulting federal penalties and immediate remediation costs would effortlessly exceed $70 million. The moment the local clerk officially stamped the forged guardianship transfer, Bradley would completely bankrupt his own development company in a single blinding instant. He believed he was stealing a simple house to fund his arrogant waterfront expansion. In reality, he was blindly dragging a highly toxic financial anchor directly into the center of his vulnerable corporate empire. Willis slowly processed the sheer destructive magnitude of my meticulously engineered trap. He offered a grim smile, realizing Bradley was about to entirely annihilate himself without us ever lifting a physical finger against him today. The stillness of this secluded farmhouse provided a stark contrast to the escalating corporate war. Ebony sat completely motionless on the thick woven rug in the center of the living room. The heavy wooden blinds remained tightly shut against the descending twilight. She held the severely burned photograph of her mother with an obsessive, unwavering focus. Her delicate fingers traced the warped edges of the glossy paper over and over again. I observed her silent ritual from the kitchen counter while brewing a fresh pot of black coffee. She flipped the photograph over and stared intently at the blackened cardboard backing. She suddenly reached into her small canvas bag and retrieved a specialized ultraviolet pen light. Her mother had apparently gifted her the specialized tool years ago to read hidden municipal engineering blueprints. Ebony clicked the small button on the base of the metal cylinder. A harsh violet beam illuminated the charred surface of the photograph. She urgently gestured for Willis and me to approach the center of the rug. I knelt down beside her and looked exactly where the violet beam was concentrated. Faint, intricate numerical coordinates were meticulously scrawled across the unburned center of the cardboard backing. The sequence of digits had been entirely invisible under the standard incandescent lighting of the farmhouse. Valerie Thorne had deliberately encoded her final message using a specialized invisible ink designed exclusively for secure architectural drafting. Ebony pointed a trembling finger directly at the glowing numbers. The sequence did not resemble a standard geographic location or a typical bank vault combination. The long string of characters contained alternating letters and mathematical symbols. She looked up at my brother with a silent, desperate plea for translation. The burned photograph was not merely a sentimental keepsake for a grieving child. It was a heavily encrypted map. Willis knelt down on the woven rug and pulled a small leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket. He spent his entire professional auditing career hunting down hidden financial assets buried deeply within complex corporate structures. He stared intensely at the glowing ultraviolet characters and began transcribing the exact alphanumeric sequence onto the blank paper. His analytical mind immediately recognized the underlying structural framework of the mysterious digital coordinates. Willis explained that these were not traditional geographical coordinates leading to a physical location. He pointed out the specific repeating algorithmic patterns embedded directly within the numerical sequence. He recognized the distinct format as a highly secure static Internet Protocol address commonly utilized by anonymous offshore data servers. Valerie Thorne had not hidden the physical evidence of Bradley's corrupted construction practices inside the bank vault. She had merely utilized the bank deposit box to protect the original physical steel samples. The actual devastating digital whistleblower files containing thousands of forged inspection reports and fabricated structural integrity documents were uploaded directly into an untraceable foreign server. Willis tapped the tip of his metal pen against the leather notebook. The second portion of the ultraviolet sequence contained the exact cryptographic access keys required to breach the digital firewall and retrieve those hidden files. If we successfully accessed that specific server, we could instantly download every single piece of absolute proof verifying that Bradley intentionally built skyscrapers using lethally compromised materials. We possessed the ultimate digital weapon capable of completely annihilating his corporate empire overnight. Willis looked up at me with an expression of profound, grim realization. He stated that whoever possessed these exact digital access codes held the absolute power to send the husband of my biological daughter directly into federal prison for the absolute remainder of his natural adult lifetime without fail. The immediate triumph of discovering the hidden server access codes was abruptly shattered by the harsh, shrill ring of my encrypted perimeter alert system. I turned sharply toward my laptop screen positioned on the solid oak dining table. Bradley's private security contractors were far more resourceful than I had initially anticipated. They had managed to successfully bribe a municipal transportation worker to illegally access the county-wide traffic surveillance grid. The corrupted technicians utilized a high-resolution toll booth camera image to positively identify the license plate on Willis's dark blue sedan. The private mercenaries had swiftly tracked our physical movements directly through the rural backroads to the northern perimeter of the county. I watched the live high-definition security feed transmitting directly from the hidden cameras mounted within the weeping willow trees outside the farmhouse. Two heavy black utility vehicles parked silently at the exact edge of the unpaved gravel driveway. 6 heavily armed tactical contractors stepped out onto the damp soil wearing unmarked black combat uniforms. They did not announce their presence or attempt to serve any fabricated legal paperwork. They immediately deployed in a highly coordinated offensive formation, fanning out across the overgrown blackberry bushes to completely encircle the secluded property. I observed the lead contractor calmly extract a heavy, kinetic breaching ram from the rear compartment of his idling vehicle. He signaled his team to advance toward the reinforced iron front door with absolute ruthless precision. They fully intended to smash their way into the house and execute their violent objectives without leaving a single trace of their presence. The secluded farmhouse was no longer a secure sanctuary. It had rapidly transformed into a highly compromised tactical trap. I closed the laptop screen and calmly instructed Willis and Ebony to gather their belongings immediately right now. I did not waste a single second panicking over the heavily armed contractors closing in on our position. I had purchased this specific farmhouse precisely because it sat directly above a network of forgotten subterranean utility tunnels originally constructed during the early 19th century. I walked quickly into the kitchen and grabbed the rusted iron ring set flush against the wooden floorboards. I hoisted the heavy concealed trapdoor, revealing a dark, narrow stone staircase plunging directly into the damp earth. I ordered Ebony and Willis to descend into the subterranean passageway without making a sound. The thick, reinforced iron door at the front of the house began to groan violently under the immense repetitive impact of the heavy kinetic breaching ram. The contractors were mere seconds away from fully splintering the doorframe and flooding into the main living room. Before stepping down into the dark tunnel, I paused beside the solid oak dining table. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a standard black flash drive. I had deliberately engineered this specific digital storage device years ago, anticipating a scenario exactly like this one. I placed the small black rectangle openly in the exact center of the table, guaranteeing it would immediately draw their undivided attention. The flashing red perimeter alert on my abandoned laptop screen provided the perfect illuminated backdrop to sell the digital deception. I stepped downward into the stone tunnel and pulled the wooden trapdoor securely shut above my head just as the front entrance violently shattered into jagged pieces. We plunged into the absolute pitch-black darkness of the underground escape route, leaving my meticulously rigged digital trap sitting innocently behind. The arrogant contractors were about to steal the exact tool required to permanently dismantle their employer entirely tonight without any warning at all. The heavily armed tactical contractors shattered the reinforced iron front door of the farmhouse into countless jagged splinters. They flooded into the main living area with military precision, sweeping every single room for any sign of human occupation. The leader of the mercenary unit signaled the perimeter guards to secure the broken entryway while he approached the solid oak dining table. His eyes instantly locked onto the standard black flash drive sitting completely isolated beside the glowing screen of my abandoned laptop. He smiled behind his tactical mask, firmly believing he had successfully captured the exact digital evidence his wealthy employer desperately needed to suppress. He confidently pulled a highly secure encrypted laptop from his heavy combat harness and booted up the operating system. He plugged the small black rectangle directly into the primary data port. He expected to uncover the hidden architectural files exposing the fatal structural flaws in the waterfront development project. He remained entirely oblivious to the lethal digital trap I had carefully engineered. The heavily modified flash drive contained absolutely zero municipal engineering documents. The moment the metallic connector breached the terminal, it instantly deployed a highly sophisticated silent malware program, perfectly disguised as a routine background system update. The aggressive digital virus completely bypassed the military-grade firewalls and instantly burrowed deep into the central nervous system of their secure communications network. The virus rapidly established an undetectable backdoor directly linking the mercenary laptop to the massive private servers housed within Bradley's corporate headquarters downtown. Down in the damp darkness of the subterranean utility tunnel, I felt my secure mobile device vibrate intensely inside my pocket. The digital confirmation illuminated the screen, proving my invisible infiltration was completely successful. I now possessed total, unrestricted remote access to every single confidential communication Bradley had ever created. We emerged from the subterranean tunnels just miles away and eventually secured a new, highly anonymous location on the industrial outskirts of the city. I immediately opened my secure portable terminal and began silently monitoring the vast ocean of hacked emails pouring directly from Bradley's corporate network. I utilized customized search algorithms specifically designed to hunt for the name Valerie Thorne across a decade of hidden correspondence. The digital dragnet swiftly isolated a heavily encrypted folder buried deep within a forgotten archived server directory. I systematically cracked the outdated passwords and accessed the deeply concealed communication logs. My eyes scanned the glowing text, revealing a horrific exchange between my biological daughter and her wealthy husband, strictly dated exactly 10 years ago. The email thread did not contain the casual domestic chatter of a naive young wife willfully ignoring her husband's ruthless corporate ambitions. Monica was actively participating in the brutal execution of the lethal conspiracy. I read a specific message composed entirely by Monica, explicitly complaining about the surprisingly high financial cost of hiring professional arsonists to completely burn Valerie Thorne's residential house to the ground. She callously calculated the exact price of human life against the projected profit margins of the massive waterfront development project. Monica coldly argued that the violent cleaners were severely overcharging them for a simple nighttime fire. She demanded that Bradley aggressively renegotiate the murderous contract to ensure their personal financial liquidity remained entirely intact. The digital words burned brightly against the dark monitor, completely eradicating any lingering doubt regarding her absolute complicity in the catastrophic blaze. My daughter was not a passive observer trapped within a toxic marriage. She was a fully aware, calculating architect of the structural violence that permanently orphaned the quiet, traumatized teenager currently sleeping peacefully in the adjacent room tonight. I pushed the rolling chair away from the illuminated digital monitor and stood perfectly still within the stark shadows of the industrial safe house. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to experience profound, devastating parental grief for exactly one solitary minute. I visualized the tiny, innocent infant I had tenderly cradled within my arms so many decades ago. I remembered teaching her how to ride a bicycle and proudly watching her graduate from the university with honors. I actively permitted the heavy, suffocating sorrow of losing my only biological child to temporarily wash completely over my entire soul. The 60 seconds ticked away relentlessly inside my analytical mind, tracking the brief, permissible mourning period with absolute precision. When the silent internal countdown finally concluded, the overwhelming sadness instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, hardened concrete. The undeniable digital evidence glaring from the laptop screen effectively eradicated any lingering, desperate hope I secretly harbored regarding her potential innocence. Monica was not a deeply misguided victim blindly trapped under the abusive psychological control of a manipulative husband. She was a fully autonomous, conscious participant in a highly orchestrated execution plot designed to protect her own lavish financial comfort. She had willingly traded a human life for expensive designer clothes and extravagant corporate galas. I permanently shut down all remaining emotional attachments regarding my biological daughter. I methodically disconnected the deeply ingrained psychological wiring that inherently bonds a father to his offspring. She was no longer my child. She was merely another structurally compromised entity actively posing a severe lethal threat to the innocent people I had sworn to fiercely protect. I opened my eyes and returned to the glowing monitor, ready to systematically and completely dismantle the corporate empire she had built directly upon the charred foundation of Valerie Thorne. I retrieved my encrypted mobile device from the heavy wooden desk and dialed the highly secure private line belonging directly to my extremely trusted attorney. Garfield answered the call immediately, fully prepared for my latest operational directive. I spoke with the icy mechanical precision of a man executing a flawless structural demolition. I instructed Garfield to officially initiate the massive liquidation process regarding my expansive offshore blind trust. I ordered him to systematically unfreeze the immense hidden capital I had quietly accrued over my entire engineering career. The massive influx of previously concealed liquid funds would serve as our primary offensive weapon moving forward into the conflict. I deliberately shifted my focus toward the highly detailed financial dossiers displaying prominently across my laptop screen. The hacked corporate emails clearly revealed the highly volatile and fragile nature of Bradley's vastly overextended commercial empire. He had recklessly utilized massive high-interest corporate loans to aggressively fund his latest luxury waterfront development projects. I instructed my attorney to actively utilize our newly liquidated funds to rapidly purchase every single ounce of outstanding debt currently financing Bradley's entire corporate infrastructure. Garfield was explicitly ordered to aggressively acquire the primary commercial notes through heavily disguised anonymous offshore shell corporations. We were going to silently buy the underlying financial foundation resting directly beneath his arrogant feet. Once we possessed the absolute majority of his corporate debt, we could legally demand immediate total repayment at our earliest possible convenience. Bradley firmly believed he was an invincible apex predator hunting a weak, defenseless old man. He had absolutely zero understanding that I was silently transforming into his exclusive financial overlord tonight. I disconnected the call and watched the hacked corporate emails continue pouring rapidly across the screen, waiting patiently for his inevitable total collapse to definitively begin now. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bradley's penthouse executive office suite downtown. He stood behind his massive mahogany desk, radiating an entirely false sense of absolute invincibility. His lead construction contractor sat across from him, demanding immediate payment for the next phase of the luxury waterfront development. The project was severely behind schedule, and the heavy machinery operators absolutely refused to pour another yard of concrete without seeing cleared funds. Bradley smirked with arrogant condescension and casually tossed his solid black titanium corporate credit card across the polished wooden surface. He boasted about his limitless credit lines and instructed the contractor to process the massive payment immediately. The contractor inserted the heavy metal card into a mobile payment terminal and typed in the 7-figure transaction amount. The digital screen processed the request for exactly 3 seconds before flashing a stark, bright red error message indicating the transaction was instantly and completely declined. Bradley snatched the terminal from the man's hands, assuming it was a simple technological malfunction. He aggressively swiped the card a second time with intense, mounting frustration. The screen displayed the exact same devastating decline notice. He grabbed his office telephone and furiously dialed his primary commercial banking representative, demanding an immediate explanation for the humiliating delay. The bank manager answered with a cold, trembling voice and delivered the catastrophic financial news. Bradley's entire network of corporate accounts was permanently frozen by federal authorities. The moment Bradley had greedily transferred my modest residential property deed into his vast commercial portfolio, he had unknowingly triggered the massive dormant environmental tax lien I had meticulously engineered decades ago. The federal government had instantly locked down every single liquid asset he possessed to secure the $70 million toxic remediation penalty. His funds were gone. Absolute panic immediately consumed the luxurious executive suite as the grim reality of the financial lockdown became undeniably clear. The lead construction contractor stood up from his chair and forcefully snatched the mobile payment terminal off the mahogany desk. He loudly declared that his entire crew was walking off the waterfront job site right now and firmly threatened to initiate massive union strikes if the missing wages were not deposited by noon. He stormed out of the glass office, leaving the heavy oak doors wide open behind him. Bradley completely lost his carefully manicured composure and swept his arm across the desk violently, sending expensive glass monitors and crystal decorations crashing directly onto the hardwood floor. He paced the room like a caged animal, realizing his entire corrupt development company was mere hours away from total public bankruptcy. The unfinished luxury towers would instantly transform into rusting monuments of his spectacular financial failure. In a state of pure, unadulterated desperation, he lunged for his cellular device and furiously dialed my biological daughter. Monica answered the call from the plush interior of her imported luxury sports car, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic corporate meltdown currently unfolding downtown. Bradley did not offer any customary greetings or gentle explanations. He screamed directly into the receiver with a vicious, untamed ferocity, demanding that she immediately wire transfer every single dollar she had ruthlessly stolen from my personal retirement accounts into his primary commercial holding fund. He explicitly ordered her to utilize the forged medical proxy to liquidate my life savings to temporarily float his sinking empire. He threatened her with absolute financial ruin if she failed to provide the necessary cash injection instantly. Monica frantically agreed to execute the illicit transfer, completely unaware that my defensive countermeasures were already rigidly in designated active place. Monica violently slammed her foot against the brake pedal, pulling her luxury vehicle abruptly onto the shoulder of the busy municipal highway. She balanced her mobile tablet against the steering wheel with trembling hands and rapidly accessed the offshore banking portal where she had parked my stolen pension funds. She utilized the heavily forged medical proxy documents she had proudly secured from the corrupt local magistrate, expecting to effortlessly deploy my entire life savings to rescue her husband from corporate destruction. She typed in the secure transaction routing numbers, intending to shift the stolen liquid cash directly into Bradley's commercial escrow accounts. She pressed the confirmation button and watched the digital loading icon spin continuously for exactly 5 agonizing seconds. Suddenly, the application screen turned completely gray and displayed a massive, flashing federal warning banner. The automated banking system bluntly informed her that the transaction was permanently denied and the funds were entirely inaccessible. The notification explicitly stated that the target accounts had been comprehensively seized by federal regulatory authorities operating under strict suspicion of severe elder financial fraud. Monica stared blindly at the unyielding digital text, entirely unable to process the absolute magnitude of her disastrous failure. She had arrogantly assumed I was a helpless old man passively awaiting my eventual demise. She never anticipated that I had strategically flagged those specific standard savings accounts with the Federal Banking Commission the exact moment she foolishly presented the fabricated guardianship paperwork. I had proactively engineered a secondary digital snare directly linking her fraudulent medical proxy to a massive federal elder abuse investigation. Monica frantically dialed her personal banker, but the call went straight to an automated compliance voicemail. Her grand illusion of untouchable financial supremacy shattered completely, leaving her staring at a blank, unyielding digital error screen in utter defeat. Bradley stood entirely alone inside the wreckage of his luxurious executive office, surrounded by the shattered glass of his ruined corporate monitors. He listened to Monica sobbing hysterically through the phone speaker, rapidly explaining that the stolen pension funds were permanently locked inside a federal fraud investigation. He disconnected the call without offering his wife a single comforting syllable. He realized with chilling clarity that his commercial development company was completely bankrupt and facing an immediate hostile takeover. The massive environmental tax lien had utterly destroyed his relationship with every legitimate banking institution across the continent. His subcontractors were aggressively preparing to file devastating civil lawsuits, and the grand opening of his waterfront property was an impossible dream. Cornered and functioning on pure, unfiltered desperation, Bradley opened a heavily encrypted messaging application on his personal mobile device. He bypassed his highly paid corporate lawyers and reached out directly to a ruthless underground criminal syndicate he had previously utilized to quietly eliminate troublesome municipal zoning inspectors. The clandestine organization operated entirely outside the strict boundaries of traditional financial regulations, relying exclusively on extreme violence to collect their outstanding debts. Bradley requested an immediate emergency cash infusion of $20 million to temporarily satisfy his aggressive subcontractors and restore the illusion of absolute corporate stability. The syndicate leader demanded an exorbitant high-interest return rate alongside an absolutely non-negotiable guarantee of repayment within 30 days. Having exhausted every single legitimate option, Bradley recklessly pledged his entire unfinished commercial real estate development company as direct collateral for the massive illegal loan. He blindly signed away his very existence, firmly believing he could somehow manipulate the underground syndicate just as easily as he had manipulated his naive wife. He had just handed his own executioners the absolute master key to his impending destruction today. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the concrete canyons of the financial district as I navigated Willis's vehicle toward the downtown central bank. The digital devastation we had unleashed upon Bradley the previous night was absolute, but the final physical component of our strike remained unsecured. We parked in an anonymous underground garage and moved swiftly toward the surface level. Ebony walked closely between Willis and me, her posture rigid with residual trauma, but her eyes burning with newfound defiance. She held the small, intricately carved brass key her mother had secretly passed to her before the fatal fire. That key unlocked a highly secure safety deposit box containing Valerie Thorne's original physical ledger. The handwritten architectural notes and raw material samples inside that steel box provided the irrefutable physical verification for every single forged digital file we had extracted from the offshore server. If Bradley somehow deduced the existence of the physical ledger before we secured it, He would utilize his newly acquired syndicate resources to violently destroy the building rather than allow the evidence to surface. We approached the towering bronze doors of the central banking institution just as the morning rush of corporate executives flooded the expansive marble lobby. I instructed Willis to maintain a watchful perimeter near the main entrance, while I escorted Ebony directly toward the secure vault access corridor. We needed to execute the retrieval with flawless precision and vanish back into the industrial shadows before Bradley even realized we had temporarily stepped into the daylight. We crossed the polished floor, completely focused on the heavy steel gate separating us from the final piece of the devastating puzzle. We approached the polished mahogany reception desk to request immediate access to the subterranean vaults. A junior bank associate with a heavily gelled haircut took my authorization forms and glanced casually across the marble counter. His eyes abruptly locked onto Ebony's face for a fraction of a second too long. He quickly lowered his gaze and frantically began typing on his concealed keyboard. Bradley had explicitly weaponized his fraudulent guardianship order by distributing a highly classified municipal watch list to every corrupted contact within his vast financial network. The junior associate was a low-level informant seeking a lucrative corporate bounty. He silently triggered an emergency alert directly to Bradley's private security detail, completely bypassing standard banking protocols. I immediately recognized the subtle, panicked shift in the employee's body language and firmly grasped Ebony's shoulder to guide her toward a secondary exit. We barely managed to take 5 steps before the massive bronze doors of the main entrance violently swung open. Bradley marched into the grand marble lobby, flanked by 6 heavily armed private security contractors. These were not the standard corporate guards he previously employed. Their unmarked tactical gear and cold predatory movements clearly indicated they were the ruthless underground syndicate enforcers he had desperately hired the night before. The armed men fanned out instantly, shoving protesting banking clients aside and completely blocking every available exit with military efficiency. Willis attempted to intercept the lead enforcer but was violently shoved against a marble pillar by 2 massive contractors. Bradley sneered with absolute toxic arrogance as he spotted us near the vault corridor. He adjusted his expensive tailored suit and walked purposefully across the echoing floor, bringing his violent entourage directly into our path. Our quiet extraction had instantly devolved into a highly public ambush. Bradley aggressively closed the final distance between us and violently shoved me backward until my spine collided sharply with the heavy marble edge of the teller counter. 2 of his syndicate enforcers stepped forward to physically block Ebony from moving their hands, resting menacingly upon their holstered weapons. Bradley leaned in close, his breath reeking of stale coffee and unfiltered desperation. He completely ignored the terrified gasps of the civilian bank customers scrambling toward the edges of the grand lobby. He stared down at Ebony with absolute malice before returning his cold gaze directly to my face. He hissed that his temporary legal guardianship granted him total unilateral authority over the runaway teenager. He explicitly threatened to drag her out of the building by her hair and throw her directly into the darkest, most violent psychiatric ward within the state custody system. He promised with absolute chilling certainty that she would be heavily sedated and permanently silenced before the sun went down. Bradley then extended his open palm, demanding I immediately surrender the small brass vault key clutched tightly in Ebony's trembling hand. He proudly declared that he knew exactly what Valerie Thorne had hidden inside the subterranean deposit box. He demanded the physical ledger, arrogantly assuming its destruction would permanently eradicate the final threat to his waterfront development project. He pressed his forearm against my chest, leveraging his physical weight to emphasize his absolute dominance in the situation. He confidently whispered that I was nothing but a broken, useless old man who had foolishly brought a helpless child to a corporate slaughter. He demanded the brass key right now, promising a swift and brutal end to our lives if I dared to resist his authority for one more second. I remained completely stoic against the cold marble counter, refusing to flinch or display even a microscopic fraction of the fear Bradley so desperately craved. The intense parental rage I had permanently sealed away the previous night remained locked within a vault of cold, hardened logic. I looked past Bradley's sneering face and offered a single, almost imperceptible nod to the senior bank manager standing silently behind the reinforced teller glass. The manager immediately bypassed the security partition and walked directly onto the main lobby floor, completely ignoring the aggressive posturing of the armed syndicate enforcers. He held a crisp, embossed legal folder. He stopped inches away from Bradley and calmly handed him a certified, irrefutable financial document. Bradley snatched the paper with a scoff, his eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal text. The color instantly drained from his arrogant face as his mind processed the catastrophic reality printed before him. The document officially certified that my anonymous offshore blind trust had aggressively acquired the absolute majority shareholder interest in this specific central banking institution exactly 4 years ago. I did not just hold an account here. I literally owned the building, the vault, and the ground he was currently standing upon. Before Bradley could utter a single word of protest, I raised my right hand. At my silent command, the bank's heavily armed internal security detail, previously stationed invisibly along the mezzanine level, stepped forward in perfect unison. A dozen elite tactical officers racked their high-caliber weapons, simultaneously aiming the lethal barrels directly at the heads of Bradley's hired syndicate men. The deafening mechanical clatter of chambered rounds echoed violently through the grand marble lobby. The arrogant predator had blindly cornered his prey directly inside the absolute center of my impenetrable financial fortress. Bradley stared at the dozen high-caliber weapons leveled directly at his chest. The suffocating realization of his absolute powerlessness washed over his arrogant features, draining the remaining color from his face. He slowly raised his empty hands and signaled his hired syndicate enforcers to completely lower their firearms. The private mercenaries possessed zero loyalty beyond their financial compensation, and they immediately recognized they were severely outgunned inside a highly secured financial fortress. Bradley took a rigid, humiliating step backward, his eyes burning with toxic fury as he silently retreated toward the grand bronze doors. He vanished into the morning sunlight, completely empty-handed. I did not waste a single second celebrating the minor tactical victory. I placed my hand gently on Ebony's shoulder and guided her past the heavily armed internal security detail toward the secure, subterranean access elevators. We descended deep below the bustling financial district into the climate-controlled silence of the central banking vault. The heavy titanium blast doors parted with a pressurized hiss, revealing thousands of polished steel deposit boxes lining the reinforced concrete walls. Willis stood guard at the primary corridor entrance while I escorted Ebony down the narrow metallic aisle. She clutched the intricately carved brass key her mother had bravely protected. We located the specific numeric designation corresponding to the decoded ultraviolet coordinates. Ebony stepped forward with a profound sense of heavy purpose. Her delicate fingers did not tremble as she inserted the brass key into the mechanical lock. She turned the cylinder with a sharp click and pulled the heavy metal drawer entirely free from the wall. She placed the rectangular steel container onto the private viewing table, unlocking the final, unassailable truth her mother had sacrificed her life to preserve. I opened the lid of the heavy steel container and revealed the devastating physical evidence Bradley had violently sought to permanently destroy. Valerie Thorne had meticulously compiled an absolute masterpiece of undeniable forensic documentation. I carefully extracted a thick stack of original handwritten structural engineering reports detailing the exact material specifications for Bradley's crown jewel. The documents explicitly proved that he had intentionally utilized lethally substandard, highly compromised steel to construct the primary load-bearing framework of the city's highest-funded commercial tower. As a licensed structural engineer, I instantly recognized the catastrophic implications detailed within the margins. Bradley was not merely cutting financial corners. He was knowingly building a towering glass death trap capable of collapsing and massacring thousands of innocent civilians the moment a severe weather event struck the coastline. Beneath the damning architectural files sat a small, securely wrapped digital audio recorder. I activated the device and pressed the small speaker against my ear. The crisp, unmistakable voice of Bradley echoed from the tiny machine, aggressively negotiating the absolute destruction of Valerie Thorne's home with an underground arsonist. He explicitly detailed the exact time the fire should start and callously mandated that no survivors should escape the blaze. The recording served as the ultimate irrefutable confession to premeditated capital murder. Ebony stared down at the physical ledger with tears streaming silently across her cheeks. She finally possessed the tangible proof that her courageous mother was a brilliant, heroic whistleblower who died actively attempting to prevent a massive municipal tragedy. I gently closed the metal lid and secured the files inside my leather briefcase. Bradley's fate was no longer a theoretical corporate dispute. It was now a fully documented criminal execution waiting to be officially triggered. We bypassed the corrupted local police precinct, entirely refusing to expose the volatile evidence to any municipal authority operating under Bradley's illicit payroll. I utilized the bank's secure subterranean logistics tunnel to evacuate Ebony and Willis without ever stepping foot back onto the public streets. We traveled deep underground through a network of abandoned subway maintenance corridors until we reached a heavily fortified bunker situated directly beneath the industrial district. I had previously secured this concrete safe room years ago for highly sensitive corporate document storage. Garfield was already waiting for us inside the starkly illuminated underground facility. My trusted attorney sat behind a simple metal folding table, his sharp eyes instantly assessing the heavy leather briefcase securely clutched in my hand. I placed the metal deposit box directly onto the table and opened the lid, revealing the catastrophic structural reports and the lethal audio recordings. Garfield meticulously examined every single page with clinical, terrifying precision. He cross-referenced Valerie Thorne's physical handwritten ledger with the massive digital cache of hacked corporate emails we had extracted the previous night. He confirmed that the physical signatures and the digital communication logs perfectly corroborated one another, creating an absolutely unbreakable chain of legal custody. Garfield looked up from the documents and stated that attempting to prosecute Bradley within the highly compromised state judicial system would be a fatal tactical error. The local judges and municipal magistrates were too deeply entangled within Bradley's toxic financial web to guarantee a clean, uncorrupted conviction. We needed an overwhelming judicial force entirely immune to Bradley's regional corporate influence. We needed to bypass the state infrastructure completely and strike him from an altitude he could not possibly defend against or manipulate with stolen cash. I instructed Garfield to absolutely ignore the corrupted local jurisdiction and immediately elevate our massive evidentiary package to the highest possible judicial authority. Garfield packed the original documents and the secure audio files into a reinforced, tamper-proof carrying case. He possessed a highly trusted, deeply uncorrupted contact serving as a senior prosecutor within the federal judicial system. He departed the subterranean safe room and drove directly to a secure federal courthouse located 3 counties away from Bradley's toxic sphere of influence. He bypassed standard bureaucratic filing procedures and delivered the unassailable package directly into the hands of a federal grand jury. The panel of federal investigators reviewed the staggering combination of hacked internal emails, fraudulent environmental dodging, intentional use of lethal construction materials, and premeditated arson, resulting in capital murder. The irrefutable mountain of evidence triggered an immediate devastating legal cascade. The grand jury did not deliberate for days or request additional preliminary hearings. They instantly issued a comprehensive sealed federal indictment against Bradley and his entire corporate development syndicate. The sealed nature of the federal mandate guaranteed that Bradley remained completely oblivious to the massive judicial hammer currently swinging directly toward his arrogant head. He was currently bleeding cash, desperately attempting to manage his frozen bank accounts and scrambling to appease a violent underground syndicate with a fraudulent development project. He falsely believed his primary enemy was a retired structural engineer utilizing clever financial tricks. He had absolutely zero comprehension that the full, unlimited weight of the federal government was quietly mobilizing a massive tactical task force to completely eradicate his existence. The master trap was perfectly set, and the final corporate execution was now entirely inescapable. The federal gears ground forward in absolute silence while Bradley remained trapped entirely within his own manufactured delusions of grandeur. Completely oblivious to the sealed federal indictment hanging like a heavy guillotine directly over his head, he focused his manic energy upon executing the highly anticipated waterfront development gala. The lavish corporate event was originally intended to be a glorious victory lap celebrating his total domination of the municipal real estate market. It had now violently transformed into a desperate high-stakes survival maneuver. He urgently needed to secure massive immediate capital injections from elite private investors to pacify the ruthless underground criminal syndicate breathing down his neck. He paced the floor of his luxury penthouse apartment, furiously barking last-minute directives at his terrified event coordinators over the phone. Monica stood before a gilded full-length mirror, meticulously adjusting a diamond necklace that cost more than a standard suburban mortgage. She remained willfully blind to the rapidly deteriorating state of her husband's corporate empire, choosing instead to obsess over the intricate details of her designer evening gown and the seating arrangements for the city's political elite. She firmly believed the emergency loan Bradley secured had effortlessly stabilized their financial trajectory. She possessed zero comprehension that the temporary cash infusion was tied directly to a violent underground organization that routinely mutilated defaulting debtors. They operated under the shared toxic assumption that they had successfully weathered the recent financial turbulence and were mere hours away from securing enough fresh investor capital to render themselves permanently untouchable. They aggressively polished their public masks of extreme wealth and unshakable confidence, preparing to host the absolute most important social event of their lives while actively standing upon a rapidly disintegrating financial trapdoor. The venue for the evening gala was strategically situated within the massive glass atrium of Bradley's newly constructed flagship corporate headquarters. This towering billion-dollar complex dominated the city skyline, serving as the ultimate physical manifestation of his boundless greed and unyielding ambition. He had ruthlessly selected this specific location to unveil the digital architectural renderings of his upcoming expansive waterfront development to the gathered billionaires. The deep, horrific irony of the location was thoroughly inescapable to anyone who actually knew the bloody history of the land. Bradley was proudly showcasing his glittering luxury towers on the exact geographical coordinates where a vibrant working-class neighborhood had once stood. He had systematically terrorized the original residents, utilizing aggressive zoning intimidation and predatory lending practices to forcefully drive them out of their homes. When Valerie Thorne and a small coalition of stubborn homeowners actively refused to sell their properties to his shell corporations, he escalated from financial pressure to outright lethal violence. He ordered the devastating nighttime arson that burned her modest house to the ground and claimed her life. He utilized the tragic fire to completely condemn the entire block, declaring it an unlivable hazard to swiftly bulldoze the remaining structures. He literally poured the deep concrete foundations of his shiny new empire directly over the charred ashes of Valerie Thorne's murdered existence. Monica and Bradley intended to stand beneath the brilliant crystal chandeliers tonight and cheerfully clink champagne flutes with wealthy investors while actively ignoring the silent graveyard resting directly beneath the polished marble floors. They planned to sell the lucrative illusion of urban renewal and luxury waterfront living to eager billionaires completely confident that the buried secrets of their violent real estate acquisitions would remain safely suppressed in the dark earth forever. I did not intend to allow Bradley and Monica to enjoy their lavish celebration undisturbed. I monitored the intricate event preparations from my secure subterranean bunker, utilizing the remote access established by the flash drive malware. I accessed the detailed logistical blueprints for the corporate gala and immediately identified a critical vulnerability within their perimeter security. Bradley had hired the most exclusive elite catering company in the state to service the event, ensuring flawless presentation for his prospective investors. I instructed Garfield to execute a rapid hostile acquisition of the catering enterprise using my newly unfrozen offshore funds. Within 2 hours, the quiet financial transaction was entirely finalized, and I became the absolute legal owner of the prestigious culinary organization. I immediately terminated the original waitstaff scheduled for the evening shift and seamlessly replaced them with my own highly specialized private security team. The veteran contractors I hired were not standard event personnel. They were elite tactical operatives highly trained in covert surveillance and close-quarters crisis management. They arrived at the corporate headquarters fully dressed in crisp white tuxedo shirts and tailored black vests, flawlessly blending into the elegant environment. They quietly infiltrated the grand glass atrium carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres and crystal champagne flutes. They systematically positioned themselves at every critical choke point, securing the primary interior exits, isolating the VIP viewing areas, and surrounding the main presentation stage. Bradley's hired syndicate enforcers remained stationed exclusively at the exterior doors, entirely focused on preventing unauthorized guests from entering the building. They possessed absolutely zero awareness that my private army had already successfully breached the interior perimeter and assumed total control of the gala floor right under their arrogant noses. The trap was now fully operational from the inside out. As the sun dipped below the city skyline and the first wave of wealthy investors began arriving at the glittering corporate headquarters, my encrypted mobile device received a forwarded audio file. The interception program I had quietly installed on my original disconnected cellular number captured a new voicemail directly from my biological daughter. I clicked the audio file and listened to Monica's voice echoing through the stark underground safe room. She did not sound panicked or remorseful regarding her recent failed attempt to legally steal my entire life savings. She sounded wildly intoxicated by her own perceived invincibility. She deliberately left a vicious, mocking message explicitly inviting me to crawl out of whatever pathetic hole I was currently hiding in just to watch her succeed. She arrogantly detailed the immense wealth circulating through her grand ballroom tonight, boasting that she and Bradley were actively securing hundreds of millions of dollars in new capital. She laughed with a cold, synthetic cruelty, telling me to turn on the local television news tomorrow morning so I could watch them unveil the waterfront project while I rotted in cowardly isolation. She proudly proclaimed that they had officially won the war and that my pathetic attempts to disrupt their corporate empire had ultimately amounted to nothing. She firmly declared that she was entirely done pretending to care about a weak, obsolete old man who lacked the vision to appreciate true power. Every single toxic syllable she recorded permanently cemented her absolute moral point of no return. She had willingly extinguished the final microscopic ember of familial connection existing between us. I calmly deleted the audio file from the server without experiencing a single heartbeat of hesitation or lingering grief. I closed my secure laptop, locked the heavy metal case containing the irrefutable evidence, and prepared to personally attend the gala tonight. The grand glass atrium of the newly constructed corporate headquarters had been flawlessly transformed into a massive, glittering ballroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the shimmering city skyline, serving as a majestic backdrop for Bradley's ultimate triumph. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the region's absolute financial elite. Corrupted municipal politicians, wealthy offshore investors, and predatory real estate moguls gathered in small, exclusive circles, clinking expensive champagne flutes. They eagerly discussed the highly anticipated waterfront development project, completely unaware they were standing directly above the hidden ashes of Valerie Thorne's murdered neighborhood. The ambient hum of privileged conversation instantly quieted as the sophisticated lighting system dimmed. A solitary, brilliant spotlight illuminated the center of the grand presentation stage. Bradley strode confidently up the carpeted steps and grasped the edges of the polished mahogany podium. He projected the flawless image of an untouchable corporate titan. He flashed a brilliant, perfectly rehearsed smile at the sea of billionaires and began delivering a charismatic speech about pioneering the future of urban luxury. He gestured expansively toward the digital architectural renderings glowing on the massive screens behind him. He spoke with the absolute conviction of a man who firmly believed his severe financial bleeding had been permanently stanched by the underground syndicate loan. He remained entirely ignorant of the sealed federal indictment currently finalizing his total destruction. He absorbed the thunderous applause from the captivated audience, bathing in the intoxicating validation of his fabricated success. He was delivering the performance of his lifetime to secure the massive capital investments required to keep his fragile empire afloat. The thunderous applause echoing throughout the grand ballroom was abruptly severed by a heavy, echoing thud. The massive mahogany doors situated at the absolute rear of the venue swung violently open, hitting the marble walls with bone-jarring force. The sudden, aggressive intrusion sent a visible ripple of shock directly through the crowd of elite investors. I stepped confidently into the brilliant light of the ballroom, completely shattering the pathetic illusion of the broken, incapacitated old man Bradley had legally fabricated. I was not wearing the worn canvas work clothes they associated with my former engineering days. I wore a perfectly tailored, immaculate charcoal suit that radiated absolute, unyielding authority. Ebony walked closely by my side, holding her head incredibly high despite the overwhelming presence of the city's most powerful predators. She clutched the heavy leather briefcase containing her mother's physical ledger with an iron grip. Garfield and Willis flanked us like highly disciplined generals entering a conquered territory. Our sudden appearance instantly paralyzed the entire room. The wealthy guests stopped drinking their champagne and stared in profound silence at the highly coordinated intrusion. Bradley froze behind the mahogany podium. His charismatic smile instantly evaporated, and the color drained completely from his arrogant face. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He stared directly at the man he had legally declared mentally incompetent and violently kidnapped. We did not pause at the entrance. I locked my eyes directly onto Bradley's terrified face and took my first deliberate step onto the plush carpet of the center aisle. Monica stood near the front row of the VIP seating area, clutching a crystal champagne flute. She recognized my face and immediately shattered the stunned silence of the ballroom with a piercing, hysterical shriek. The fragile glass slipped from her trembling fingers and exploded violently against the polished marble floor. She pointed a frantic manicured finger directly at my chest and demanded immediate physical intervention. She screamed at the top of her lungs for the private security guards lining the perimeter of the room to forcefully arrest the dangerous intruders and remove her father from the premises. She commanded them to protect the corporate gala from a severe security breach. The dozens of hired guards dressed impeccably in crisp white shirts and tailored black vests simply folded their hands behind their backs. They remained entirely motionless like statues carved from solid granite. They completely ignored Monica's desperate, escalating commands. My elite private tactical operatives maintained their absolute operational discipline and refused to acknowledge the screaming woman. The sheer insubordination displayed by the supposed corporate security detail sent a massive wave of immediate confusion and mounting terror directly through the gathered billionaires. The wealthy guests began to frantically murmur among themselves, instinctively sensing a massive catastrophic shift in the power dynamic of the room. Monica rushed toward a muscular guard stationed near the presentation stage and violently shoved his shoulder, demanding he draw his weapon and follow her explicit orders. The operative stared straight ahead with a cold, dead expression, completely unfazed by her physical assault. Monica stumbled backward, realizing with absolute horrific clarity that the men guarding the doors were not working for her husband anymore. Bradley witnessed his wife's total public humiliation and felt his manufactured corporate empire rapidly collapsing around his feet. Total, unadulterated panic replaced his carefully constructed, arrogant facade. He abandoned his prepared speech and frantically looked upward toward the elevated audio-visual control booth overlooking the grand ballroom. He wildly waved his arms and slashed his hand aggressively across his throat in a desperate universal command to immediately cut the audio feed and kill the stage microphones. He needed to silence the room before his investors witnessed a complete security failure. The sound technicians stationed inside the glass booth simply crossed their arms and stared down at him with cold indifference. My hired operatives had completely secured the control room an hour before the gala began. They explicitly refused to touch the mixing board or lower the volume by a single decibel. The primary stage microphone remained completely active and highly sensitive. The sophisticated audio system broadcasted Bradley's ragged, terrified breathing and his desperate muttered curses directly across the massive ballroom for every single billionaire to hear clearly. I did not rush my approach. I walked directly up the center aisle with slow, measured, predatory steps. The sea of elite politicians and wealthy developers actively parted before me, scrambling out of my path in stunned, absolute silence. Nobody dared to intercept my steady march toward the presentation stage. The grand illusion of Bradley's supreme power was entirely dismantled in front of his most crucial financial lifelines. I stopped exactly at the base of the wooden stairs. I looked up at the cornered predator gripping the podium and prepared to deliver the final lethal blow to his entire existence. The suffocating silence in the grand ballroom held for a fraction of a second before Bradley's fragile composure shattered entirely. Stripped of his corrupted security detail and publicly exposed before his critical financial lifelines, pure animalistic panic overrode his remaining logic. He let out a guttural roar of unadulterated rage, abandoning the mahogany podium and lunging directly across the elevated stage. He hurtled down the carpeted steps with his fists tightly clenched, intent on physically assaulting the man he had ruthlessly attempted to erase from existence. He aimed a wild, desperate strike directly at my face, putting the entire weight of his failing empire behind the violent blow. I did not raise my hands to block him or retreat in fear. I simply shifted my weight and pivoted smoothly to the left, executing a calculated evasion I had practiced countless times in my youth. The sheer momentum of his uncontrolled assault carried him violently forward through empty air. Bradley lost his footing completely and tumbled past me, crashing heavily onto the polished marble floor at the base of the stairs. The impact echoed sharply through the live stage microphone, broadcasting the humiliating sound of his physical collapse to every single billionaire in the room. He scrambled frantically against the smooth stone, his expensive, tailored suit tangling around his knees as he struggled to right himself. The wealthy investors, municipal politicians, and real estate moguls who had just applauded his visionary genius now stared down at him with collective disgust and profound embarrassment. He was no longer a corporate titan pioneering the future of urban luxury. He was a pathetic, sprawling mess of a man bleeding out his final ounces of dignity on the floor of his own extravagant gala. I looked down at him with cold clinical detachment, refusing to offer a single word of gloating or anger. As Bradley remained paralyzed on the marble floor, Garfield bypassed him entirely and ascended the short flight of stairs to the presentation stage. My trusted attorney approached the abandoned mahogany podium and tapped the live microphone, once drawing the absolute undivided attention of the stunned audience. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly upward toward the secured audio-visual control booth. He delivered a single sharp nod to my tactical operatives stationed behind the thick glass. The massive digital screens dominating the stage instantly flickered. The brilliant, glowing architectural renderings of Bradley's waterfront luxury towers were abruptly terminated, replaced immediately by the stark, undeniable reality of cold legal text. A series of heavily redacted but unmistakable financial injunctions and forensic structural reports flashed across the enormous digital displays. The documents meticulously exposed the lethal, substandard steel Bradley had knowingly authorized for his flagship construction, completely obliterating the pristine illusion of his visionary development. The crowd of elite investors leaned forward in synchronized horror, their eyes rapidly scanning the projected evidence of catastrophic engineering fraud and gross negligence. The silent gasps of the municipal politicians rippled through the room as they recognized the official seals of the federal investigators stamped aggressively across the damning paperwork. Garfield commanded the room with the practiced authority of a veteran prosecutor. He did not yell or resort to cheap theatrical dramatics. His voice was a calm, lethal blade cutting directly through the heavy air of the grand ballroom. He announced to the gathered elite that the man trembling on the floor before them had built his entire corporate narrative upon a foundation of severe financial manipulation, illegal municipal zoning intimidation, and premeditated capital murder. The investors began to instinctively back away from the stage, physically distancing themselves from the toxic epicenter of a massive criminal conspiracy unfolding live before their eyes. Garfield pressed his hands flat against the edges of the podium and leaned toward the microphone to deliver the fatal financial strike. He projected his voice with absolute clarity, announcing to the entire ballroom that Bradley's primary corporate holding company possessed zero actual liquid capital. He detailed how the lavish waterfront project was currently sustained by highly volatile illicit loans secured through extremely violent underground syndicate channels. The elite investors who had arrived fully prepared to write massive multi-million-dollar checks to fund Bradley's vision abruptly froze as they realized they had been targeted as ignorant marks in a desperate corporate bailout scheme. Garfield did not allow the shock to settle before driving the final nail into the coffin. He formally declared that exactly 1 hour prior to the commencement of this gala, my newly unmasked financial trust had ruthlessly purchased Bradley's primary, toxic commercial debt directly from the underground syndicate. By legally absorbing the massive liability, I had instantly become his sole, uncompromising creditor. Garfield read directly from a verified legal mandate announcing that the entire astronomical balance of the loan had been called in for immediate, non-negotiable repayment. Bradley was officially, irreversibly bankrupt. The attorney firmly advised every single individual in the room that all corporate accounts tied to this specific development had been completely frozen by federal authorities pending a massive criminal investigation. Any investor who had foolishly wired preliminary capital to Bradley's holding firm within the last 48 hours had just watched their money evaporate into an untouchable federal lockbox. The collective realization of massive financial jeopardy sparked a wave of panicked, urgent whispers across the ballroom floor. Wealthy moguls frantically pulled out their mobile devices, desperately attempting to contact their private bankers to halt any pending wire transfers before their own fortunes were dragged down into the abyss. The towering digital display behind Garfield shifted one final time. The complex forensic engineering reports and bankruptcy filings faded into a crisp, high-resolution scan of a single municipal land deed. The document represented the exact geographical footprint of the massive billion-dollar headquarters we were currently standing inside, including the surrounding waterfront acreage Bradley had violently stolen from Valerie Thorne's community. The legal paperwork projected across the entire wall prominently displayed my name as the absolute, uncontested owner of the commercial property. I had quietly leveraged my vast, unmasked offshore resources to aggressively acquire the parent holding company that technically leased the land to Bradley's construction firm. I did not just destroy his project. I had legally evicted him from the very ground he built his false empire upon, taking back the ashes of the neighborhood he had burned. Bradley stared up at the massive projection from his pathetic position on the marble floor. His eyes widened in absolute unfiltered horror as his mind finally processed the sheer, devastating magnitude of my silent adjustment. His entire corporate empire, his political influence, and his carefully manicured public identity had dissolved instantly into nothingness. He was completely broke, federally indicted, and about to be actively hunted by the brutal enforcers he had failed to repay. He scrambled upright, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He lunged toward the VIP section and violently grabbed Monica's arm, ignoring her shocked cry of pain. He dragged his terrified wife forcefully toward the secondary exit, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper tearing through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. He told her they needed to reach their private vehicle and flee the country immediately before the federal task force locked down the city borders entirely. He pulled her into the dark corridor, completely unaware that my tactical operatives had already permanently disabled their luxury escape vehicle. Bradley shoved his weight against the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP exit, his fingers frantically clawing at the polished brass handles. He dragged Monica violently by the wrist, desperately attempting to plunge into the shadows and secure their immediate escape from the collapsing gala. Before he could pull the heavy door ajar, a deafening shriek of electronic feedback ripped through the grand ballroom. The piercing frequency shattered the chaotic murmurs of the panicked investors, forcing everyone in the immediate vicinity to cover their ears in sheer agony. Bradley froze instantly, his physical escape route blocked not by a barricade of guards, but by the sheer commanding force of the sudden audio assault. He snapped his head back toward the elevated presentation stage. The towering digital display, which had just broadcasted the humiliating loss of his entire corporate empire, abruptly shifted its broadcast. The high-resolution scan of my municipal land deed dissolved into total darkness. A stark, pulsating green audio waveform violently slashed across the massive black screen. The jagged neon lines spiked and dropped in perfect synchronization with the rhythmic hum of a newly activated, highly secured audio file. The entire room fell into a terrified, breathless silence, completely captivated by the menacing visual display glowing above them. Monica released a shaky gasp and tightened her grip on her husband's arm, instinctively sensing the arrival of a fatal, inescapable blow. My tactical operatives, positioned inside the elevated control booth, had flawlessly executed the next phase of the digital strike. Garfield stood completely still behind the podium, his face a mask of cold judicial anticipation. He did not need to offer any grand introductions or dramatic commentary. The jagged green lines dancing across the screen required absolutely no further explanation. Bradley remained paralyzed near the exit, his eyes fixed on the digital waveform as his ultimate unforgivable sin queued up to broadcast directly to the city's elite. The massive concert-grade acoustic system, originally installed to amplify Bradley's glorious corporate victory, suddenly broadcasted a chillingly familiar voice. Bradley's own arrogant, unfiltered tone echoed off the crystal chandeliers, incredibly crisp and utterly devoid of his usual manufactured charm. The immaculate audio quality left absolutely zero room for plausible deniability or legal spin. The entire ballroom listened in horrified paralysis as the covert recording captured Bradley aggressively negotiating the financial logistics of a lethal arson attack. His recorded voice explicitly ordered the underground syndicate enforcer to burn Valerie Thorne's modest residence to the ground. The audio did not leave a single brutal detail to the imagination. The wealthy investors heard Bradley specifically mandate that the fire must be ignited during the early morning hours to guarantee maximum structural devastation and minimal chance of survival. Then, a second voice joined the damning broadcast. Monica's sharp, callous tones sliced through the heavy silence of the ballroom. She eagerly encouraged the violent destruction of the property, brutally laughing as she demanded that no survivors be allowed to escape the flames. She callously discussed the subsequent insurance payouts and the immediate clearance of the lot for their highly profitable luxury waterfront development. Every single wealthy mogul and municipal politician present heard the undeniable reality of the couple's monstrous depravity. They had not just bypassed environmental regulations or aggressively intimidated stubborn homeowners. They had actively, joyfully coordinated the premeditated execution of a heroic whistleblower and her innocent family. The jagged green waveform spiked violently with every cruel laugh and every murderous directive. The chilling echo of their recorded apathy settled over the crowd like a heavy executioner's shroud. They had built their entire glittering billion-dollar empire upon the charred, stolen graves of innocent people, and the undeniable audio proof was currently vibrating through the floorboards of their own grand gala. The conclusion of the gruesome audio recording served as a violent detonator within the center of the grand ballroom. The absolute silence fractured instantly into pure, unadulterated chaos. The city's elite investors, corrupted municipal politicians, and predatory real estate moguls scrambled desperately toward the primary exits, violently shoving one another aside in a frantic, undignified stampede. They recognized the immediate severe legal toxicity of remaining inside the building for a single second longer. Nobody wanted their name, their corporate brand, or their face associated with a publicly exposed capital murder investigation. Crystal champagne flutes shattered against the marble floors as the wealthy elite abandoned their expensive coats and their carefully manicured dignity, fleeing the toxic epicenter of Bradley's permanently ruined empire. Through the surging, panicked crowd, Ebony stood entirely motionless. She anchored herself perfectly still in the center of the chaotic aisle, completely ignoring the frantic billionaires rushing past her shoulders. She refused to retreat or seek the safety of the shadows. She locked her unblinking, fiercely defiant gaze directly onto the faces of the people who had murdered her mother. The profound trauma and profound grief she had carried for months crystallized into an unbreakable armor of absolute strength. Bradley stared back at the brave teenager, the last remaining shred of his insufferable arrogance evaporating instantly from his ashen, sweating face. He was completely stripped of his stolen wealth, his powerful syndicate connections, and his untouchable public facade. He stood totally exposed as a cowardly, desperate killer facing the living embodiment of his monstrous crimes. Monica slumped against the heavy mahogany door, her knees buckling completely as she slid down the polished wood, sobbing hysterically into her trembling hands. They could no longer hide behind expensive corporate lawyers or municipal bribes. Ebony's unwavering stare served as the ultimate judge and jury, silently condemning the broken predators to the exact fate they had so ruthlessly engineered for others. The frantic commotion inside the grand ballroom was abruptly overpowered by a massive, piercing mechanical wail rising rapidly from the city streets below. The unmistakable, deafening blare of approaching federal sirens sliced directly through the heavy glass walls of the corporate atrium. The sound multiplied, rapidly echoing aggressively off the surrounding skyscrapers as a massive convoy of heavily armored tactical vehicles converged upon the billion-dollar complex. Dozens of high-intensity red and blue strobe lights violently pierced the darkness outside, washing through the towering stained glass windows and painting the panicked faces of the remaining guests in frantic, flashing colors. The brilliant strobes completely overpowered the warm golden glow of the crystal chandeliers, turning the luxurious venue into a stark, illuminated crime scene. Bradley pushed himself away from the mahogany door and stumbled blindly toward the reinforced glass overlooking the main avenue. He looked down and watched in sheer, paralyzed horror as a highly coordinated federal task force established an impenetrable, heavily armed perimeter around his entire property. Dozens of federal agents poured out of the tactical vehicles, instantly securing every single exit and entrance with flawless military precision. The sealed federal indictment Garfield had miraculously secured hours ago was now arriving with the full, uncompromising force of the national government. There would be no convenient municipal bailouts, no corrupt local judges left to secretly bribe, and absolutely no dark corners left to hide within. I adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal suit and watched the flashing emergency lights reflect brilliantly off the polished marble floors. The carefully engineered trap had sprung shut with flawless, terrifying efficiency. Bradley and Monica were entirely surrounded, trapped permanently within the glittering glass cage they had built upon stolen ashes. The ultimate corporate execution was finally complete, and the federal authorities were marching swiftly through the lobby to claim the remaining shattered pieces of their destroyed lives. The heavy mahogany doors at the front and rear of the grand ballroom exploded inward simultaneously with a deafening crash. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents wearing black tactical gear flooded the luxurious space in a flawlessly synchronized breach. The piercing beams of tactical flashlights attached to their high-caliber rifles cut through the dim golden light of the crystal chandeliers. Their heavy combat boots pounded against the polished marble floor as they aggressively established a total lockdown of the venue. The commanding officer of the federal task force shouted absolute, uncompromising orders through a heavy bullhorn, demanding that every single individual inside the room freeze immediately and keep their hands entirely visible. The remaining corporate elite, municipal politicians and wealthy investors who had not managed to escape the initial panic were violently shoved against the towering glass walls of the atrium. The billionaires who had just toasted to Bradley's fabricated vision of urban luxury were now treated like common criminals, corralled and isolated by an overwhelming military presence. My private tactical operatives smoothly transitioned from their covert catering disguises and merged seamlessly with the incoming federal force, silently transferring total control of the perimeter to the government agents. Bradley remained frozen near the secondary exit, completely cornered and entirely stripped of his power. A pair of federal agents immediately rushed him, grabbing his expensive tailored suit jacket and forcefully throwing him face first against the nearest marble pillar. They violently kicked his legs apart and locked heavy steel cuffs around his wrists with a brutal snap. He did not utter a single word of protest, utterly paralyzed by the catastrophic reality of his total corporate execution. The entire glittering empire he had built upon stolen ashes was now completely under federal occupation. Monica watched her husband being violently pinned against the marble pillar by federal agents and instantly calculated the absolute finality of their destruction. The cold, synthetic superiority she had proudly weaponized on the voicemail merely an hour ago vanished entirely. Pure, unadulterated panic completely consumed her manicured features. She whipped her head around, wildly searching the chaotic ballroom until her frantic eyes locked onto my face. She abandoned her captured husband and lunged across the polished floor directly toward me. She collapsed violently onto her knees right at my feet, the expensive fabric of her designer evening gown tearing against the hard stone. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and desperately clawed at the fabric of my tailored charcoal suit. Heavy, hysterical sobs racked her entire body as she began to rapidly weave a pathetic web of frantic lies. She wildly claimed that she was completely innocent, screaming that Bradley had manipulated every single aspect of the toxic waterfront development. She wept hysterically, swearing that she possessed absolutely no prior knowledge of the lethal construction materials or the violent underground syndicate loans. She pointed a trembling finger directly at the man she had married and viciously accused him of acting alone in ordering the arson that murdered Valerie Thorne. She stared up at me with mascara streaming down her cheeks, desperately begging me to utilize my massive, newly unmasked offshore wealth to legally shield her from the federal indictment. She pleaded for me to hire the best criminal defense attorneys in the country and buy her freedom, promising she would instantly divorce Bradley and return home if I just saved her from federal prison. She firmly believed she could still manipulate my paternal instincts to escape the catastrophic consequences of her own monstrous greed. I looked down at the weeping woman clutching my suit jacket, and I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, agonizing well of parental grief that had secretly tormented me for years had been permanently cauterized by the horrific audio recording currently resting inside Garfield's heavy leather briefcase. My eyes remained completely devoid of any lingering warmth or residual affection. I did not bend down to comfort her, nor did I flinch as she desperately dug her nails into my clothing. I simply stood like a pillar of cold, unyielding stone amidst the swirling chaos of the federal raid. I waited for her frantic, hysterical pleading to momentarily pause before I delivered the absolute final verdict on our relationship. I spoke in a quiet, incredibly steady voice that sliced directly through the noise of the grand ballroom. I calmly recited the exact alphanumeric routing number of the offshore bank account she had used to finance the deadly arson. Monica froze instantly, the breath catching violently in her throat. I then quoted her own exact words, ripped verbatim from the encrypted digital emails we had meticulously extracted from Bradley's private corporate server. I repeated the precise sentence where she aggressively haggled over the bloody price of Valerie Thorne's life, complaining to the syndicate enforcer that $50,000 was too high a premium for a simple neighborhood fire. I recited her explicit written command to execute the blaze during the darkest hours of the night to guarantee maximum property destruction. I watched the last spark of manipulative hope completely die inside her widened eyes. I possessed the undeniable digital proof that she was not a helpless, manipulated wife. She was the primary architect of the mass murder, a ruthless predator who had enthusiastically financed the slaughter to secure her waterfront luxury project. Monica stared up at me in absolute horrified silence, completely paralyzed by the realization that her most depraved, deeply buried sins were now fully exposed to the light. The fabricated illusion of her innocence had been entirely dismantled by the unassailable digital evidence currently sitting in federal custody. She opened her mouth to construct another pathetic excuse, but no words materialized. I did not allow her the opportunity to speak another toxic syllable. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of the woman I had spent decades sacrificing my own happiness to protect and provide for. I stated with absolute unwavering conviction that the greedy, murderous predator kneeling before me was entirely unrecognizable. I declared in a cold, steady voice that carried the absolute finality of a judge reading a terminal sentence that I had no daughter. With those irreversible words, I severed the final rotting thread of our familial bond forever. I smoothly stepped backward, physically breaking her desperate grip on my tailored suit jacket. My deliberate retreat served as a silent, immediate signal to the federal task force securing the perimeter. Two heavily armored agents instantly closed the distance between us, their tactical boots thudding aggressively against the marble floor. They grabbed Monica by her upper arms and violently hauled her to her feet, completely ignoring her sudden panicked shrieks. They twisted her arms behind her back with practiced mechanical efficiency and locked heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The cold snap of the metal ratchets echoed sharply through the grand atrium. I turned my back on the pathetic scene and began walking toward the main exit alongside Ebony and Garfield. The blinding red and blue emergency lights continued to flood the shattered corporate ballroom as I left Monica to face the absolute crushing reality of a federal prison sentence alone. Bradley did not waste a single fraction of a second mourning the spectacular collapse of his marriage or the impending incarceration of his wife. As the heavily armored federal agents aggressively pinned Monica against the polished marble pillar, he recognized his absolute final window of opportunity. He seamlessly blended into the chaotic surge of terrified investors stampeding toward the primary exits using the bodies of his former financial lifelines as a human shield. He expertly navigated the panicked crowd and veered sharply toward the perimeter of the grand atrium, moving swiftly past the shattered crystal champagne flutes and discarded silk jackets. He reached the concealed heavy steel service door designated exclusively for the elite catering staff and shoved it open with his shoulder. The heavy panel slammed shut behind him, instantly muffling the deafening federal commands and the hysterical shrieks of the ruined municipal elite. He found himself inside the sterile, brightly illuminated industrial kitchen corridor. He discarded his restrictive suit jacket onto a stainless steel preparation counter and sprinted toward the emergency fire stairwell. His expensive leather shoes slapped violently against the raw concrete steps as he rapidly descended into the subterranean depths of the billion-dollar corporate headquarters. His breath tore through his lungs in ragged, burning gasps, but a manic, delusional surge of adrenaline propelled him downward. He frantically calculated his immediate survival trajectory, entirely convinced he could reach his armored luxury vehicle, bypass the municipal lockdown, and access a secondary offshore account completely undetected. He firmly believed his superior intellect would allow him to outmaneuver the federal dragnet. He reached the lowest subterranean level and pushed through the heavy fire door, stepping directly into the cavernous climate-controlled parking structure. The echoing silence of the underground garage felt like a vast sanctuary compared to the catastrophic raid unfolding in the ballroom above. He patted his pockets to confirm he possessed his encrypted electronic ignition key, fully prepared to vanish into the night and rebuild his empire from the shadows. The subterranean garage was completely devoid of the chaotic flashing emergency lights dominating the surface streets. Bradley moved briskly across the polished concrete floor, his eyes fixed on the sleek black silhouette of his customized luxury vehicle parked in the exclusive executive bay. He pressed the electronic unlocking mechanism on his fob, anticipating the familiar, reassuring chirp of the security system. The vehicle remained entirely silent and completely unresponsive. He pressed the button a second time, with mounting frustration aggressively slapping the plastic device against his palm. As he closed the final distance to the armored car, a deep, resonant scrape of heavy leather shoes echoing against the concrete paralyzed him completely. The dark, elongated shadows stretching across the parking bay began to shift and separate. 6 massive, heavily armed men stepped smoothly into the dim fluorescent lighting, completely blocking his path to the vehicle. These were not the federal agents he had desperately fled from upstairs. They were the ruthless, unregistered syndicate enforcers he had recklessly borrowed $20 million from less than 24 hours ago. The men wore unmarked dark clothing, their faces set in expressions of cold, predatory anticipation. They had not come to the gala to protect his corporate interests or secure the perimeter. They had bypassed the federal blockade to directly secure their financial investment. The lead enforcer leaned casually against the hood of Bradley's disabled luxury vehicle, absent-mindedly tossing the vehicle's ripped ignition wiring harness onto the ground. The sudden suffocating realization of his absolute entrapment crashed down upon Bradley. He was physically pinned between a massive federal raid descending from the towering glass atrium and a heavily armed execution squad waiting patiently in the subterranean depths. The overwhelming stench of stale exhaust fumes and damp concrete filled his nostrils as the last shreds of his arrogant invincibility evaporated. He took a slow, trembling step backward, instinctively raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender as the syndicate men drew their lethal suppressed firearms in perfect synchronization. The lead syndicate enforcer pushed himself away from the disabled armored vehicle and closed the distance with slow, deliberate steps. He did not raise his voice or display any outward signs of anger. He spoke with the chilling, monotonous efficiency of a corporate auditor finalizing a lethal transaction. He calmly informed Bradley that the massive underground loan was officially in catastrophic default. The public declaration of his corporate bankruptcy upstairs had immediately triggered the syndicate's violent collection protocols. The enforcer explicitly stated that the unfinished commercial real estate development Bradley had arrogantly pledged as collateral was now legally owned by an anonymous offshore entity and currently locked under a massive federal indictment. The billion-dollar towers were entirely untouchable. The enforcer raised his suppressed weapon and aimed the black barrel directly at the center of Bradley's chest, brutally explaining that his physical life was the only remaining currency acceptable to satisfy the astronomical debt. Bradley collapsed entirely, falling to his knees on the cold concrete floor. The immaculate corporate titan who had just commanded the attention of the city's wealthiest elite was now openly weeping and begging for his life in a subterranean parking bay. He frantically clasped his hands together, pleading with the cold-eyed executioner for a mere 24-hour extension. He desperately promised to liquidate hidden foreign assets, sell his remaining personal properties, and empty Monica's private accounts to cover the massive deficit. He swore he could orchestrate an immediate wire transfer if they simply allowed him to reach a secure terminal. The syndicate leader stared down at the sobbing billionaire with absolute disgust. He cocked the hammer of his heavy firearm, explicitly rejecting the pathetic negotiation and preparing to execute the defaulting debtor right on the concrete floor. Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body convulsing with unadulterated terror as he braced for the imminent lethal impact. He had spent his entire career ruthlessly crushing the vulnerable, entirely oblivious to the reality that true predators always collect their debts in blood. Before the syndicate enforcer could pull the trigger and finalize the brutal execution, the massive reinforced steel doors of the primary parking garage entrance exploded inward with catastrophic force. Two heavily armored federal tactical transports smashed directly through the security barriers, their heavy tires screeching violently against the polished concrete. A deafening chorus of emergency sirens and authoritative commands completely shattered the subterranean silence. Dozens of elite FBI tactical units poured out of the black vehicles in a flawlessly synchronized swarm, instantly flooding the cavernous garage with blinding, high-intensity tactical flashlights. The brilliant white beams aggressively cut through the dark shadows, totally neutralizing the syndicate operative's visual advantage. Heavily amplified voices boomed over military-grade bullhorns, explicitly commanding every single individual in the immediate vicinity to drop their weapons and lie flat on the ground. The criminal enforcers, instantly recognizing they were massively outgunned and completely surrounded by elite federal firepower, did not hesitate. They immediately dropped their suppressed firearms onto the concrete floor, kicking the lethal weapons away and raising their hands in total surrender. Bradley remained frozen on his knees, surrounded by the deafening chaos of the federal breach. He stared at the blinding red and blue strobe lights reflecting off the subterranean walls. A bizarre, deeply twisted sense of psychological relief washed entirely over his shattered mind. The federal agents aggressively moved forward, slamming the syndicate members against the cold concrete and securing their wrists with heavy steel cuffs. Two heavily armed agents grabbed Bradley by his tailored shirt, hauling him violently to his feet. As the cold metal ratchets locked tightly around his own wrists, Bradley finally comprehended the absolute irony of his destruction. The federal prison system was no longer his worst nightmare. It was the only remaining sanctuary capable of keeping him alive. The immediate aftermath of the spectacular raid at the Grand Ballroom consumed the city's news cycles and financial sectors for an entire week. The shocking arrest of the region's most prominent developer sent a catastrophic shockwave through the municipal government, prompting rapid resignations and sudden early retirements from corrupt politicians desperate to distance themselves from the blast radius. Bradley's meticulously constructed corporate empire did not simply collapse. It was systematically dismantled, aggressively liquidated, and sold for scrap by the relentless precision of Garfield's elite law firm. My attorney moved with the cold, lethal efficiency of a financial surgeon. He filed immediate injunctions that permanently froze every single domestic and international asset tied to Bradley's holding companies. The lavish waterfront luxury towers, once the crown jewel of a stolen neighborhood, were immediately seized by federal regulators and transferred directly into the control of a community restoration trust dedicated to Valerie Thorne's memory. Garfield orchestrated the public auction of Bradley's remaining corporate infrastructure, stripping the company of its heavy machinery, architectural patents, and prime real estate leases. The massive infusion of illicit syndicate cash that had briefly kept the firm afloat was entirely confiscated by government authorities as material evidence of severe money laundering and racketeering. Bradley's name was physically pried off the towering glass atrium of his former headquarters, leaving only the scarred concrete behind. His fleet of armored luxury vehicles, his private executive jets, and his expansive portfolio of stolen residential properties were seized to fully compensate the contractors he had deliberately defrauded and the victims he had violently displaced. Within 7 days, the man who had arrogantly attempted to erase my entire existence had been completely erased from the financial map. His legacy was reduced to a mountain of seized assets and a heavily redacted federal evidence file. The intense media circus reached a fever pitch as Bradley and Monica made their initial appearance inside the crowded federal courthouse. The grand mahogany courtroom was packed entirely to capacity with investigative journalists, defrauded investors, and the silent, imposing presence of Valerie Thorne's surviving community members. Ebony sat perfectly still in the front row, flanked closely by Willis and my private tactical operatives, watching the architects of her mother's murder face the absolute reality of their crimes. Bradley and Monica were led into the secure defendant's enclosure, wearing bright orange institutional jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy steel transport chains. The stark institutional clothing completely stripped away their manufactured aura of wealth and untouchable power. They looked exhausted, terrified, and profoundly diminished. Despite their catastrophic financial ruin, they had somehow managed to retain a pair of high-priced, aggressive criminal defense attorneys who immediately initiated a theatrical campaign to secure their release. The lead defense counsel stood before the federal magistrate and passionately argued for immediate bail. He completely ignored the overwhelming severity of the charges and aggressively highlighted the couple's previous standing within the community. He painted Bradley as a visionary job creator and Monica as a dedicated philanthropic socialite, insisting they possessed deep, unbreakable ties to the city. The attorney claimed that their heavily publicized arrest was merely a sensationalized misunderstanding involving complex corporate zoning regulations, utterly dismissing the brutal arson and premeditated murder as baseless fabrications. He passionately requested that the judge grant them pretrial release under standard house arrest, arguing that two prominent, highly visible public figures posed absolutely zero threat of fleeing the jurisdiction. Bradley managed to straighten his posture slightly, desperately clinging to the pathetic illusion that his wealth and influence could still manipulate the justice system. The defense attorney's impassioned plea for pretrial release was immediately dismantled the moment Garfield approached the prosecutor's table, acting as an appointed special counsel. My attorney did not rely on emotional rhetoric or theatrical posturing. He opened his heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of verified banking ledgers and intercepted digital communications. He calmly presented the federal judge with irrefutable, undeniable evidence, detailing a massive network of hidden offshore accounts completely untouched by the initial corporate seizure. Garfield meticulously traced the complex digital pathways Bradley and Monica had explicitly established to rapidly funnel millions of dollars into untouchable foreign jurisdictions. He then presented the court with a decrypted audio file captured during the corporate gala, replaying Bradley's frantic, whispered command to Monica, urging her to reach their vehicle and flee the country immediately before the federal borders locked down. Garfield firmly reminded the judge that the defendants possessed both the hidden financial means and the explicitly recorded intent to permanently evade federal prosecution. He further highlighted that releasing Bradley would place him directly in the crosshairs of the heavily armed syndicate enforcers who were actively hunting him for an unpaid $20 million debt, creating a severe security risk for the entire municipality. The federal magistrate adjusted his glasses and reviewed the damning forensic evidence with a cold, unforgiving expression. He looked down at Bradley and Monica with absolute judicial disdain. He struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack, instantly shattering their final hopes of freedom. The judge denied the motion for bail, outright citing their extreme flight risk, their access to illicit foreign capital, and the undeniable severity of the capital murder charges. He formally ordered both defendants to be remanded immediately into maximum security custody without the possibility of appeal. The heavy steel doors of the subterranean courthouse holding facility slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang. Bradley and Monica were immediately separated by the federal marshals and placed into isolated, heavily reinforced concrete holding cells to await their permanent transfer to the maximum security penitentiary. The suffocating reality of a life sentence behind steel bars instantly shattered whatever fragile loyalty remained between the disgraced corporate elite. Stripped of their shared wealth, their luxurious lifestyle, and their united arrogance, the primal instinct for sheer survival completely overrode their marital vows. Inside his stark, windowless cell, Bradley immediately demanded to speak with the lead federal prosecutor. He frantically offered to completely surrender his entire network of corrupted municipal politicians and explicitly detail his wife's exclusive role in coordinating the lethal arson attack, desperately attempting to secure a reduced sentence. He wildly claimed that Monica was the true mastermind behind the violence, painting himself as an ignorant businessman manipulated by a ruthless spouse. Simultaneously, exactly 2 cells down the sterile concrete corridor, Monica was aggressively executing the exact same desperate strategy. She wept forcefully to the federal investigators, violently throwing her husband under the bus. She offered to provide the FBI with full access to Bradley's hidden syndicate ledgers and explicitly testify against him in open court regarding the premeditated murder of Valerie Thorne. She begged for full federal immunity, eagerly volunteering to ensure Bradley received the lethal injection if the government simply allowed her to walk free. They were entirely unaware that the federal prosecutors had already secured the immaculate, unassailable audio recordings of them both cheerfully ordering the execution together. By frantically scrambling to destroy one another to save themselves, Bradley and Monica perfectly guaranteed their mutual, inescapable destruction. The heavy steel gates of the federal holding facility were firmly locked behind his former family, closing that dark chapter permanently. Weeks later, the sharp morning sunlight cut through the crisp autumn air as Hollis stood at the edge of his original property line. The federal investigative teams had finally concluded their exhaustive forensic sweep of the premises. Yellow crime scene tape, which had fluttered aggressively in the wind for nearly a month, was systematically removed by unsmiling government agents. A senior federal prosecutor approached Hollis, handing over a thick manila folder containing the finalized property deeds and unconditional release forms. The state formally recognized his absolute legal ownership, returning the estate he had meticulously built with his own 2 hands. He signed the final ledger with a steady hand, feeling the absolute weight of the legal victory settling over his shoulders. The government vehicles slowly pulled away from the curb, leaving him entirely alone on the sprawling front lawn. He did not rush toward the heavy oak front door. He stood perfectly still, surveying the exterior of the house that had once represented a lifetime of quiet sacrifice and unconditional provision. The structure stood as a silent witness to Monica's insatiable greed and Bradley's desperate financial scrambling. It was no longer a home. It was the empty shell of a battlefield where the ultimate war for his dignity had been decisively won. He grasped the heavy brass key provided by the authorities and slid it smoothly into the lock. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy, satisfying click, officially marking the immediate transfer of power. He pushed the heavy door inward, stepping over the threshold into the dark, echoing foyer to confront the physical remnants of his daughter's catastrophic betrayal. The interior of the estate resembled the epicenter of a violent hurricane. Hollis walked slowly through the grand foyer, his leather shoes crunching softly over pulverized drywall and shattered porcelain. Monica's absolute financial desperation had manifested into pure physical destruction. The elegant mahogany wainscoting lining the central hallway had been violently ripped away with crowbars. The thick plaster walls were peppered with massive jagged holes exposing the bare wooden studs and tangled electrical wiring beneath. She had systematically dismantled the very foundation of her childhood home in a manic delusional hunt for a hidden vault of cash that simply did not exist. He stepped into the main living room and observed the completely shredded upholstery of his antique furniture. The plush cushions had been gutted, their stuffing scattered across the imported rugs like freshly fallen snow. Even the heavy stone fireplace had been aggressively chipped away by someone wielding a heavy sledgehammer. She had desperately searched for a secret offshore ledger or a physical stash of bearer bonds to bail out Bradley's collapsing corporate empire. The sheer scale of her paranoid excavation revealed the absolute depth of her moral bankruptcy. She had viewed her father not as a human being, but as a heavily fortified bank vault waiting to be cracked open and entirely drained. Hollis navigated through the debris of the formal dining room, finding the floorboards violently pried up and ruthlessly tossed aside. The beautiful home he had meticulously maintained for decades had been utterly butchered by the very person he had sacrificed everything to protect. He did not flinch at the devastating sight of his ruined belongings. He absorbed the surrounding wreckage with cold analytical precision, recognizing that the physical damage was merely a temporary reflection of a severed bond. There was absolutely no anger left in his heart to waste on the devastation. The burning rage that had fueled his initial strategic adjustment had entirely burned out, replaced by a profound, impenetrable calm. Hollis did not shed a single tear over the destroyed antiques or the fractured plaster. He simply pulled his mobile phone from his tailored suit pocket and dialed a private number. Within exactly 2 hours, a massive convoy of heavy industrial trucks and professional demolition crews swarmed the property. He did not instruct them to carefully salvage or gently repair the existing architecture. He issued a series of cold, uncompromising directives to completely strip the entire structure down to its bare concrete foundation. He stood on the front lawn and watched with absolute detachment as the workers aggressively gutted the interior. They hauled away the shattered mahogany, the torn carpets, and the broken masonry, violently tossing decades of history into massive steel dumpsters. Every single physical memory of his biological daughter was methodically eradicated from the premises. He erased the bedroom where he had read her bedtime stories, the kitchen where he had cooked her breakfast, and the grand staircase where he had proudly watched her pose for high school dances. The demolition crew worked relentlessly for weeks under his strict supervision, entirely resetting the spatial footprint of the estate. When the demolition was finalized, he unleashed a premier architectural firm to rebuild the property from the ground up. He authorized the installation of massive floor-to-ceiling windows, open-concept living spaces, and brilliant modern fixtures. He was not just repairing a damaged structure. He was consciously forging an entirely new reality, completely free from the toxic, suffocating shadows of his past mistakes. The massive reconstruction project concluded flawlessly, just as the first heavy snows of winter began to fall across the city. The newly transformed estate radiated a warm, inviting brilliance, standing as a pristine monument to survival and hard-won justice. A black luxury sedan pulled smoothly into the freshly paved circular driveway. Ebony stepped out into the crisp air, clutching 2 heavily worn canvas duffel bags containing the absolute entirety of her physical possessions. She looked up at the stunning, brightly illuminated architecture with wide, hesitant eyes, still carrying the heavy, lingering trauma of a teenager who had lost her mother to unimaginable corporate violence. Hollis walked out onto the expansive front porch to meet her. He did not offer empty platitudes or forced emotional speeches. He simply reached into his pocket and produced a heavy ring holding a brand new set of polished brass keys. He stepped forward and placed the cold metal firmly into the center of her palm, closing her fingers tightly around them. He guided her through the heavy oak doors and into the brilliant sunlit expanse of the grand foyer. He bypassed the standard guest rooms entirely and pointed directly toward the massive, completely renovated master suite, occupying the entire southern wing of the estate. The expansive room featured glowing natural light, custom built-in bookshelves, and an unobstructed panoramic view of the distant skyline. He looked directly into her eyes and stated with absolute unyielding conviction that she would never need to pack those canvas bags again. The dark, terrifying chapter of running from federal foster care and hiding in the shadows was permanently closed. She was finally home, standing firmly upon the exact foundation where a toxic legacy had been destroyed to make room for her future. A full calendar year evaporated into a relentless cycle of legal maneuvering and aggressive federal prosecution. The highly publicized trial of Bradley and Monica completely dominated the national news cycle, captivating the public with its sheer scale of corporate depravity and lethal greed. Inside the cavernous federal courthouse, the prosecution meticulously dismantled every frantic defense strategy the couple attempted to deploy. The digital evidence Garfield had originally secured proved absolutely devastating. Prosecutors played the immaculate audio recordings of the couple casually ordering the arson attack in open court. The jury listened in stunned, horrified silence as Monica's recorded voice ruthlessly haggled over the exact price of Valerie Thorne's execution. The financial ledgers exposing Bradley's illicit syndicate loans and gross structural negligence were projected across massive screens, leaving absolutely zero room for reasonable doubt. Their high-priced defense attorneys desperately attempted to deflect blame, shifting the narrative toward rogue contractors and isolated accounting errors, but the sheer volume of forensic proof crushed their arguments entirely. Bradley and Monica's frantic attempts to testify against one another backfired spectacularly. Their respective testimonies only served to further corroborate the prosecution's timeline, tightly binding them together in a mutual suicide pact of legal self-destruction. The trial moved with a swift, punishing momentum, entirely stripping the defendants of their manufactured corporate prestige. They sat at the defense table, their complexions pale and their posture defeated, forced to endure the agonizing public autopsy of their ruined empire. The overwhelming avalanche of irrefutable facts, sworn testimonies from defrauded investors, and the unyielding digital footprint of their conspiracy made the jury's deliberation process incredibly brief. The federal prosecutors had constructed a flawless, inescapable cage of evidence, guaranteeing that the architects of the waterfront tragedy would face the absolute maximum extent of federal justice. The suffocating tension inside the courtroom reached its absolute peak as the federal magistrate prepared to deliver the final verdict. The jury foreperson stood and read the unanimous decisions with clinical, unwavering precision, declaring both defendants completely guilty on all 74 federal counts. The judge did not mince words or offer any shred of judicial leniency. He looked down from the elevated bench with cold, righteous disgust, addressing Bradley and Monica directly. He explicitly detailed the monstrous nature of their crimes, highlighting how their insatiable corporate greed had systematically destroyed an entire neighborhood and violently extinguished an innocent life. He formally condemned their actions as the absolute worst manifestation of predatory capitalism and moral bankruptcy. Without a single ounce of hesitation, the magistrate handed down the ultimate punishment. Bradley and Monica were each explicitly sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in federal prison, absolutely stripped of any future possibility of parole. The charges of aggravated racketeering, massive corporate fraud, and first-degree premeditated murder carried mandatory maximum sentences, ensuring that neither defendant would ever breathe free air again. The heavy steel gavel struck the sounding block with a violent, echoing crack that sealed their fates permanently. Monica collapsed against the wooden defense table, her manicured hands covering her face as she released a pathetic, shattered wail. Bradley simply stared blankly at the polished mahogany wood, his mind completely broken by the horrific reality of dying inside a concrete cell. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing the condemned prisoners by their arms and hauling them roughly toward the secure holding doors. The absolute finality of the sentence hung heavily in the air, a definitive closure to a dark, violent chapter of corporate tyranny. Hollis remained seated in the very last row of the crowded spectator gallery, a silent silhouette blending seamlessly into the dark oak paneling of the courtroom. He did not rise to join the scattered applause of the defrauded investors, nor did he display a single flicker of outward emotion as his biological daughter was formally condemned to rot in a federal cage. His weathered face remained an entirely impenetrable mask of absolute stoicism. He simply watched the federal marshals drag Monica and Bradley through the heavy steel doors, absorbing the final visual of their permanent removal from society. He felt absolutely no rush of triumphant victory or intoxicating joy. The destruction of his own flesh and blood offered no cause for celebration. Instead, A profound, heavy sense of grim satisfaction settled deep within his chest. The universe had been violently knocked off its axis by greed and murder, and he had personally orchestrated the precise, devastating realignment of that order. The toxic, suffocating legacy Monica had attempted to build with stolen money and innocent blood had been completely eradicated. He had utilized his vast, unmasked offshore wealth not as an instrument of petty revenge, but as a scalpel to excise a lethal tumor from the world. He remained motionless as the bustling crowd began to filter out of the grand courtroom, analyzing the absolute finality of the moment. The debt incurred by Valerie Thorne's murder had been collected in full. The balance was finally settled. He slowly stood up and adjusted the lapels of his immaculate charcoal suit. He did not spare a single backward glance at the empty defense table. He turned toward the heavy double doors of the main exit, ready to leave the suffocating atmosphere of the courthouse and step back into the reality he had meticulously rebuilt. The immediate moment Hollis pushed through the heavy bronze doors of the federal courthouse, a massive, chaotic swarm of investigative reporters and flashing cameras aggressively descended upon the granite steps. The aggressive media pack shoved heavy microphones toward his face, screaming frantic questions over the roar of the city traffic. They desperately demanded an exclusive statement regarding the historic sentencing, probing for any emotional reaction from the secretive billionaire whose estranged daughter had just been condemned to life behind bars. They shouted invasive inquiries about his hidden offshore empire, his calculated dismantling of Bradley's corporation, and his personal feelings toward Monica's ultimate demise. Hollis did not break his measured stride or offer a single syllable of acknowledgement. He maintained his cold, impenetrable stare, slicing directly through the center of the panicked media frenzy like a ghost moving through fog. His private tactical operatives flawlessly executed a moving perimeter, physically blocking the aggressive journalists and carving a clear, unobstructed path down the wide concrete stairs. A sleek, armored black luxury sedan waited idling at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing lights of the news cameras. Ebony stood patiently beside the rear passenger door, wearing a sharp-tailored winter coat. She held her head incredibly high, completely unfazed by the screaming reporters and the chaotic spectacle surrounding them. Hollis reached the vehicle and smoothly pulled the heavy door open, gesturing for her to enter safely. He did not look back at the towering courthouse or the frantic reporters clamoring for a soundbite. He simply secured the door behind her, slid into the driver's seat, and merged seamlessly into the heavy afternoon traffic. He drove steadily toward the completely renovated, sunlit estate, leaving the ashes of the past permanently in the rearview mirror. The crisp, unforgiving chill of winter eventually surrendered to the gentle warmth of a vibrant spring, allowing the newly reconstructed estate to breathe under a clear, cloudless sky. The narrative of our lives finally settled onto a remarkably quiet Sunday morning, entirely devoid of the relentless, suffocating chaos that had defined the previous year. The aggressive media circus, the endless barrage of federal subpoenas, and the suffocating presence of high-profile court proceedings had completely evaporated from our daily existence. The violent storm generated by Bradley and Monica's spectacular downfall had officially passed, leaving behind a profound, untouchable tranquility. The towering wrought-iron gates of the property remained securely locked, no longer serving as a barricade against hostile corporate invaders, but rather as a quiet guardian of our hard-won sanctuary. Inside the perimeter, the manicured lawns and newly planted oak trees thrived, replacing the shredded, toxic wasteland Monica had violently excavated during her desperate paranoid hunt for non-existent wealth. The physical scars of her greed had been entirely erased, replaced by solid, unyielding stone and flawless architecture. There were no more frantic phone calls demanding exorbitant financial bailouts, no more arrogant ultimatums echoing through the hallways, and absolutely no lingering threats from unregistered syndicate enforcers. The heavy, dark chapter of corporate tyranny and familial betrayal had been permanently closed, filed away within the concrete walls of a maximum security penitentiary. I woke up that morning without the familiar heavy weight of defensive calculation pressing down upon my chest. The constant burning necessity to outmaneuver a predatory daughter and her ruthless husband had vanished, replaced by the simple, profound luxury of absolute silence. We had survived the ultimate fire, and the resulting peace was not merely a brief pause in the conflict. It was a permanent, unbreakable reality. I stepped out onto the expansive, rebuilt front porch, carrying a steaming mug of black coffee. The heavy mahogany floorboards beneath my leather shoes were immaculate, completely free from the bitter memories of the past. I settled into a comfortable cedar chair, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs. The sharp scent of fresh pine and blooming gardenias replaced the lingering stench of federal raids and corporate decay. Willis sat completely relaxed in the chair beside me, enjoying the serene atmosphere. The formidable tactical commander who had flawlessly executed the physical dismantling of Bradley's empire was currently engrossed in the Sunday morning newspaper. He turned the broadsheet pages with a slow, deliberate calmness. The harsh lines of professional vigilance on his face significantly softened by the absolute absence of any imminent threat. We did not need to exchange words or discuss the perimeter security. The unspoken bond forged through the absolute crucible of the previous year required no verbal validation. He was no longer just a hired operative or a tactical necessity. He had become a permanent integral pillar of the quiet life we had successfully reclaimed. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the dark, rich heat anchor me firmly to the present moment. I looked at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the newly designed estate, admiring the brilliant sunlight reflecting off the flawless glass. The structure was undeniably stronger now, completely stripped of its rotten foundation and rebuilt with absolute integrity. It mirrored my own internal architecture. The agonizing vulnerability of blind paternal love had been aggressively excavated and replaced by a cold, impenetrable wisdom. The estate was finally a true home, fortified by trust and shielded by an unwavering perimeter of genuine respect. The heavy front doors swung smoothly open, and Ebony stepped out onto the sunlit porch. She carried two sleek, hard-shell suitcases, moving with a confident, purposeful stride that entirely erased the image of the traumatized, hunted teenager I had rescued from the shadows of the foster care system. She walked directly toward a pristine, newly purchased sedan, parked in the circular driveway, effortlessly loading her luggage into the spacious trunk. She was officially packing for her first year of university, embarking on a prestigious academic journey that had once been violently stolen from her. The overwhelming financial burdens that typically crush a young student had been completely obliterated. Her entire tuition, her living expenses, and her long-term financial independence were fully guaranteed. We had utilized Garfield's elite legal maneuverings to aggressively seize and liquidate the corrupt corporate assets Bradley had stolen from Valerie Thorne's community. Every single dollar generated from the sale of those waterfront properties had been redirected into an impenetrable, heavily fortified trust fund under Ebony's name. I had personally matched those recovered funds with my own unmasked offshore wealth, ensuring she possessed an absolute, untouchable financial fortress. She closed the trunk with a solid thud and turned back toward the porch, a brilliant, unburdened smile illuminating her face. The profound grief of losing her mother to corporate greed would always remain, but it no longer anchored her to the ground. It fueled her ambition. She was leaving the estate not as a helpless victim fleeing a burning neighborhood, but as a fiercely intelligent, fully empowered young woman ready to conquer her future. I watched her double-check her travel itinerary, feeling an immense, quiet pride replacing the hollow void my biological daughter had left behind. I rested my coffee mug on the wooden railing and looked out over the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood street. The flawless tranquility of the morning offered absolute clarity. I watched Ebony converse happily with Willis, their easy laughter floating across the manicured lawn. The stark contrast between this moment and the horrific reality of the past year crystallized perfectly in my mind. I realized with absolute unwavering certainty that true family is never defined by a simple genetic obligation or a shared biological bloodline. Monica had shared my blood, yet she had eagerly orchestrated my financial ruin, authorized mass murder, and ruthlessly viewed my existence as a mere stepping stone to her own corrupted wealth. She had weaponized our biological connection to engineer my total destruction. In stark contrast, Ebony and Willis shared absolutely no genetic tie to me. Yet when the inferno of Bradley's criminal conspiracy threatened to consume everything I valued, they did not hesitate or flee. They stood firmly by my side within the absolute center of the fire. Genuine family is explicitly forged in the crucible of extreme adversity. It is built entirely upon unyielding loyalty, mutual sacrifice, and unwavering respect when the chips are finally down. The people currently standing in my driveway had earned my absolute devotion through their actions, completely invalidating the toxic illusion of mandatory familial love. I had successfully excised a lethal parasite from my life, and deliberately surrounded myself with individuals possessing genuine moral integrity. I took one final slow sip of my dark coffee, letting the absolute finality of the moment wash over me. I looked at the bright, unobstructed horizon stretching out beyond the iron gates. The silent adjustment was finally complete. The ultimate lesson of this ordeal is that true strength does not reside in maintaining toxic connections for the sake of appearances. We frequently endure manipulation from those sharing our bloodline, falsely believing that loyalty requires endless suffering. However, authentic power is discovered when we decisively sever those parasitic bonds. Reclaiming your dignity demands the courage to demolish a corrupted foundation and rebuild your life with people who offer genuine respect and unwavering support. Do not allow guilt to anchor you to abusers. If you found value in this story, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video today.